Indecision will kick in so incredibly when you are constantly questioning yourself. If you're hyper-focused on the fear-mongering, it essentially stalls you from taking those steps that are necessary to do anything. Do what you want to get better at. So go thrust. Essentially, we're prescribing people to go have sex, which is a great thing. The average person is about 5 reps away from failure when they think they're at failure. The longer that you go in the eccentric, yes, it makes you more sore. Soreness is not an indicator of muscle growth. If you take loaded movements to end ranges of motion, it increases flexibility at the same extent as a dedicated stretching routine. I mean, it's amazing what NEAT accounts for, and I don't think that people realize that. I mean, NEAT, for those who are not familiar with it, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is basically a fancy way to say all the movement that we do that's not dedicated exercise. Rather than starving yourself to death where you're going to lose lean muscle if you're doing all these insane fasting protocols, you could be in a calorie deficit to lose excess body fat, and you can exercise and still maximize the benefits of autophagy.
Are you tired of trying your best to lose weight or gain muscle and not seeing any success? Well, then this episode is for you. Welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon. Today, our guest is Dr. Allan Bacon, an oral surgeon turned certified bodybuilding coach, powerlifting coach, and certified nutritionist, who today joins us to talk all about evidence-based information about exercise and nutrition. We talked about how to exercise to get better at sex. We also covered what are the characteristics of people who are successful in maintaining reaching their goals of weight loss or muscular hypertrophy. We got into the nitty-gritty about resistance training. We talked about reps. We talked about going to failure, time under tension, as well as rest periods. We also discussed nutrition. What are the big myths about nutrition? Do metabolic types matter? How do hormones affect nutrition? And what is the optimal amount of protein? We even covered how to maintain motivation while you're on this journey of improving your muscular health and weight. Let's get right to it. Dr. Bacon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Rena.
I'm so excited to meet you. I know our good friend Gabrielle Line introduced us, and she only introduces me to people who she really believes are amazing. So I have high expectations.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of those people in the industry that really kind of helps to push it forward, right? Because she facilitates these types of things, and it's great to be able to both meet like-minded people and people that are really intelligent to be able to get this type of information out there. So I do appreciate that, and I appreciate you letting me on.
Of course. So I think a lot of people don't know this about you, but you used to be an oral surgeon before you got into fitness and nutrition.
Yeah, I had a doctorate in dental surgery and I practiced for 10 years. It's a very rewarding type of training and type of lifestyle, but through various changes that happened in life, I had a switch in career. I had a father who ended up getting esophageal cancer, and he had practiced dental surgery for 10 years, or 35 years actually. I remember having a conversation with him towards the end, and I asked, what is there things about, your life that you would have done differently? And one of the things that he had mentioned was he wished that he would have spent more time with his family. He wished that he would have spent more time taking care of himself. And that really struck a chord with me. And at the same time, I was doing surgery December 24th, 8 p.m., missing out on Christmas Eve dinner with the in-laws. And I just had a kind of, come to myself moment where I talked to my wife and I said, hey, look, we've been in fitness and nutrition, helping our friends, helping people that we know for years now. How about starting a side business where we do this professionally? And she was an Olympic weightlifter. She had an American record holding competition where she earned that in 2019, where she went to Worlds. And so it was up both of our alleys, and we got into it as a secondary type of business, and then it ended up taking off. And I find that being able to help so many people take control of their life and take control of their nutrition is something that was really passionate for me. And so the change was welcome, and it gave me a decent quality of life, able to move to Hawaii and can't complain about anything from there.
It's one, I commend you for it because, I've obviously made a change in my career in terms of leaving academic medicine to come and live in California. I still work at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, but I have my own practice. I do the podcast and the YouTube channel. And it is a huge change to go from the mindset of being, a surgeon who operates all the time, who has dedicated 10 plus years in training to get to that point. And to then, to say, you know what, I'm going to take a step back and do something that will affect many more people in a positive way. But it is really hard because you begin to identify as that person who did that.
You do. And one of the really nice things about this shift that both you and I have made is that you start to move towards that side of the equation where you're preventing disease. It was great treating, and you would see so many patients and they would be very thankful of you getting them out of those situations. But I really like the idea of stopping it before it gets there. And it's not that there aren't people out there that are doing it. It's that the recommendations are becoming muddled. And there is so much noise out there that we need some people to be able to cut through that noise to actually make a difference in people's lives. And hopefully these types of podcasts, these types of conversations can actually do that long term for people.
Absolutely. And, I think that's the challenge now with the TikToks and the really misinformed but zingy content that people gravitate to. And they just take like a small portion of that with them. They're like, oh, I can eat. I saw one that was like, you can have coconut oil and it's like negative calories and you'll like, it was just so ridiculous. It didn't make any sense, but I could see someone be like, oh, I saw that. Look, I'm eating healthy. I'm doing great. Why am I not losing weight? Or why am I not, reaching my goals? And so, yeah, absolutely. The same reason is why I decided to do things on social media was to really just give evidence-based content and education that is really based in some science rather than sort of made up or extrapolated in the wrong way from small data sets that are not really accurate in the bigger scheme of things.
Well, I mean, the problem there is that hyperbolic content sells. Hyperbolic content sells to people. Hyperbolic content sells to the algorithms of these social media sites. It's almost like the tried and true isn't sexy. And because the tried and true isn't sexy, it doesn't grasp people's emotions.
Yeah.
And so we have all of these very fringe recommendations taking the forefront because they're new and because they seem exciting.
Yeah.
And if it's something that you haven't tried before, if it's something that, you're getting all this word of mouth, it seems like, hey, maybe that's the secret. And maybe that's why I didn't get to where I needed to be years ago. Maybe that's why I've been on this diet roller coaster for my entire life. And this misinformation, I think that in a lot of cases isn't meant to be in a nefarious manner. It's not meant to trick people. I think that even the people putting this stuff out don't really realize, okay, maybe the message that I'm putting out there isn't really what we should be focusing on. And so what I've noticed with social media is that instead of actually making the important choices and focusing on what we should be doing to really make a difference in our health, we are focusing on the most base bullshit minutia that you can possibly find out there because it just sounds sexy or it just sounds new or really interesting. And so this push for let's master the basics. Let's really understand how our body works. Let's really understand how food affects it. Let's really understand how training and exercise affects it, and then push those forward. And the idea of mastering the basics, if we can start to value that, we're going to actually make a major difference instead of trying to focus on, how much time should I be staying in a cold bath, or, should I be avoiding these oils, or should I be avoiding, what are all these different things that maybe have an effect, but are probably far less of the equation than what we should really be focusing on. I think we're just drawing attention away from those really important things.
Absolutely. You've got to sort of optimize the pillars before you can deal with the fringe.
Yep.
And, you probably like me, because we don't learn nutrition and exercise in medical school or dental school, had to learn it on your own.
Yep.
So tell me about some of the struggles you had in learning it, things that may be misinformation that you felt victim to, and how you sort of figured your way out of that.
So the issue with the information out there is that there's so much, right? And the best thing that a person can possibly do to further their education in the best way possible, is to find some reputable sources online. And what I mean by reputable sources is not necessarily certifications or institutions, but actual researchers in the field or doctors in the field that really have specialized in this for a long period of time. To distinguish whether or not you're getting good information from bad, because you will see certainly multiple types of people on different sides of issues. The best thing that you can possibly do is hopefully get into conversations with them, because a lot of them are very willing to do back and forths, myself included. And if there is a contentious topic, one of the best things that you can do is you can say, hey, can you explain your side of the topic to me? That's perfect, because most people are really willing to do that. If you've got peer-reviewed research, even better, because you've got some backing to be able to show why you believe the way you believe. When you get a person that really understands a topic, they not only tell you that side of the equation, but they can explain to you the other side, what the other person who disagrees with them is saying. They can explain their stance. And then they can explain why that is probably not accurate, or why that might not be accurate under the circumstances that you're discussing. And if they can explain the other side of the equation or the other side of the argument, that's where you'll really get some insight into what might actually be going on. So it's difficult in this sea of noise to really identify what's going on. But I think that the best thing that you can possibly do is have those conversations, get both sides, and then make the best decision for yourself once you have the full view of the answer. And the way that I like to give an analogy for this, if information is everything in a room, the issue that we have on social media is social media expert A, or fitness influencer, it's even worse with fitness influencers. Fitness influencer A will open up the door, and they'll take a tiny flashlight and they'll point it into one corner and they'll say, that's the answer. Mm-hmm. And you'll say, okay, cool, I can see that. But then somebody who actually knows what's really going on will be like, whoa, hold up. They'll turn the corner, turn the light on in the entire room, and then you see everything. And you see that one piece of information may not be relevant for you or under your situation, or it may be only relevant under certain specific scenarios. And so by being able to see everything from a 1,000-foot view, you get a much better idea of what's actually going on. And I think that that's the distinction that we need to start to look at, because I think that people are getting hyper-focused on that flashlight view of an issue without really understanding what's fully going on.
And I think the other issue is that people get stressed by that little issue, right? Like, for example, I need to avoid seed oils, right?
Here we go.
And so I need to avoid seed oils, but I go out to a restaurant and everything's made with seed oils. Or I go to buy some food that is convenient for me to take with me when I'm on traveling or I have a busy day, and it's all made with seed oils. Now I'm stressed because what am I going to eat? What am I going to cook? When do I have time to cook? And I'm going to bring that with me when I go out with my friends. Like, it adds all these layers of stress to your life, when in reality, like, that is a small portion of the equation, and a misinformed one at that.
Let's back up and then ask the person, okay, well, then what do they do? Indecision will kick in so incredibly when you are constantly questioning yourself. And if you're hyper-focusing on these little things that don't necessarily matter, and we can get into the specifics about this if you really want to, but if you're hyper-focused on the fear-mongering, it essentially stalls you from taking those steps that are necessary to do anything. And in situations like you're talking about, when traveling is a really important one that a lot of people deal with. If a person's traveling and they're trying to do the best that they can, and this is where I always tell people, it's the all or something mentality, not the all or nothing mentality. Mm-hmm. If we say this food is bad always, forever, and it's the only option in comparison to that food, maybe you get some seed oils in a nice salad, it's not going to take you over and calorie surplus. It's not fried. It's not, problematic in any way. And you're avoiding that because you were told that seed oils are bad. And now your only other option is fried chicken. Like, how does that make you feel mentally and emotionally? I mean, it's going to make you feel like you're failing at this attempt of becoming a healthy person. When in reality, if we were focusing on what really mattered anyways, you'd say, okay, I'm going to do the best that I can in this situation. Technically, there's nothing wrong with the situation that we posited with a seed oil and a regular calorie allotment, and not in a super high heat cooking environment. It's not going to really cause a problem. But they've been led to believe that this is always a bad thing, and unfortunately, it really affects people mentally and causes procrastination or just stalls them out completely.
Absolutely. And I'm a busy person and you can relate to this, I'm sure. But like I go to work, I need food that is, some days I just don't even have time to have lunch, right? So I need something that will fuel me for the day. And sometimes that might be a protein bar. Sometimes that might be a protein shake. These are processed foods, right? They are not perfect by all means. I will admit that. But you know what? It's quick. It's easy. I don't have to spend a lot of time preparing for my day. I can have that time allotted to stress for other things I got to deal with, right? Like the patient in front of me who I have to take care of or the operation I'm doing that day. And so I think that that's like, if something is convenient and not terribly bad for you and makes your life easier and reduces your stress, there is value in that.
And particularly if it allows you to maintain a more consistent and adherent diet to whole minimally processed foods.
Right.
And I'm not somebody that's going to come out here and say, all processed foods are bad, because the real situation is that you have to look at the level of processing, how frequently you're eating it, how much you're eating it. This all adds in. Now, I don't think that anybody can argue that whole minimally processed foods are the basis of a diet. That's just the way that it is. Whole processed foods have a lot of benefits that ultra processed foods in particular don't provide. There's a lot of issues with ultra processed foods, but there's certainly some room in a diet for them, particularly if they increase your adherence and consistency with your whole minimally processed foods. And this is where people are really kind of jumping the shark, because they're ignoring the benefits that some of these things can bring, that some of these ultra-processed foods can bring in a real everyday lifestyle. You've got that mother of 2 kids that's working 2 jobs, and should she be eating whole minimally processed foods the majority of the time? Yes, she should. And you should plan accordingly. There's times that just doesn't work out. And so maybe we have some more processed foods in play, because getting some nutrition in is important. It cuts stress down. It allows her to spend some time actually cooking more food to prep for the rest of the week, and that's just what she could get in at that time. And this idea of completely vilifying things as black and white, good and bad, is probably doing ourselves a disservice, because what we're doing is we're scaring people away from actually succeeding.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point about the wife or the mother with 2 kids at home. That's not your influencer, right? Your influencer is usually, especially if they're quite popular, has disposable income, has time to either hire someone to cook their food for them, or
it's a 30-year-old kid that just got out of college, doesn't have any debt, and is making enough money to be able to do this full time.
Right.
And that's not everybody.
Yeah.
And so there is certainly an ideal, right? And the ideal is we eat all whole minimally processed foods. We get a good omnivore style diet. No restrictive diets. They are not the best idea for an overall healthy person. Restriction you miss out on too many good things. If carnivore has problems, veganism has problems from these perspectives, from an overall nutrient standpoint intake. And if we can realize that there's an ideal, but maybe that's not what life is like all the time, then we can start to give ourselves some grace in the way that we actually do eat, and start to succeed by, actually feeling motivated by the successes that we have.
Yeah, let's talk about motivation. So when you have a client, right, and the client who's probably tried and failed many times to achieve either gains with muscular hypertrophy or weight loss, right? They've tried and maybe they haven't achieved their ideal goal, or they've failed. What are sort of green flags, like things that you look at your client, like they are definitely going to succeed because they have these characteristics?
There's multiple things that I would say are necessary to be the best coachable person. And you want to be coachable if you're going to be working with somebody and see a good chance for success. One of them is going to be, you're going to have to be open to learning, and there's certain people that, I don't know if you work with people with fitness and nutrition all the time, but there's a lot of people that will come in and you'll say, hey, look, this is a good change that we can make. This is a good change. And they're like, no, I'm not doing that. You're like, okay, you're not going to change from where you are unless you make some alterations in what you're doing. The second thing and most important thing that I find for people that want to make these changes is to accept some responsibility for where you are. Now, having said that, that can be a very aggressive thing for many people to experience. That doesn't mean that you're being judged. That doesn't mean that you deserve to be judged. That means what you've done in the past hasn't worked. And so by realizing that there are habits and routines in your life that aren't fulfilling your goals and your needs, it's the first step to learning how to adjust and actually overcome them. And so people will look at taking responsibility as a bad thing because it can make us feel less competent. It can make it feel like people are blaming us. But I think that it's necessary for people to succeed, because if you accept the fact that some of this, and maybe even all of it, is your fault, then that's okay. It doesn't mean that you are a failure. It means that you face challenges. So how can we learn about this? How can we overcome these challenges? And if we accept it as a learning experience, that's where we really start to grow, because there's not a single person that has gone on one of these weight loss journeys and hasn't screwed up, and hasn't screwed up a lot. And and I always tell clients when they start working with me, I'm like, you're going to screw up. And they're like, what? I'm like, you're going to screw up a lot. You're going to screw up all the time. So let's have a conversation about what would you want me to tell you to bring you back onto, the right path. And this is something that a coach can ask you, but I will emphasize for anybody that's going on this journey, ask yourself this and then write it down. Because it's going to be just as valuable for you to check back into this as it would be for you to ask a third person to just reiterate this to you.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about it outside of the situation where you're having a pity party and everything's down and, oh my God, you gained 3 pounds the past 2 weeks. And it's going to come up because Christmas and New Year's is happening here. And chances are you're probably going to gain a pound. And so people will wait until they're in an emotional crisis before attempting to address this type of thing. But I want people to look at this beforehand, because if you do that, you're going to set yourself up for success, because it can take you out of that emotional spiral.
Yeah.
And you can say, hey, look, I said that this is what would bring me back to my goals and what is really important to me, because there's a reason that you're doing this. And so reminding yourself of what that reason is, reminding yourself that you knew that you were going to screw up at some point, and then reminding yourself that you have some strategies to overcome it will be a very powerful thing. And if you start to look at it as not only a learning experience, but the fact that you face a challenge and you keep going as a sign of resilience, then you can spin this into a positive outlook on what you're experiencing. Yeah. Because again, there's not anybody out there that doesn't fail.
Absolutely.
And so if we start to look at this as, hey, this is par for the course, and things are essentially going as intended or what you would expect, it's okay.
And it's hard. We've all been there. I think the other thing to realize is when you are at that stage of like you failed, everyone has sort of a different way that gets them motivated. So like my husband will be like, I need David Goggins to like yell at me, basically. Like that's what I need. Like someone to just tell me to stop being a bitch and get up and move and like do the things. And whereas I need,
Have you ever said that to the wrong person?
They'd be pissed.
I did once. When I first started, I did once, and I was like, hey, it's time to suck it up. And they're like, what? And I'm like, okay, let's take a step back and we'll reevaluate. And this is the type of thing that you learn, as you work with more and more people. And you see this too in medical, right? You learn how to talk with different people in medical. And there were some people that if you were just blunt with them and sarcastic, it actually relieved their nerves. And I remember going into, wisdom teeth extractions and Lefort osteotomies and stuff like that. And whenever you did that, people would understandably be very nervous. Yeah. And there were some people that you could just be like, hey, don't be a bitch.
Yeah.
And they would respond very well, because it would be levity for them. It would break the tension.
Right.
And then you say it to other people, and it's the worst thing in the world that you can say. So, figure out what works for you. You're exactly right. And push forward with that type of thing.
And then once you figure that out, you can use that, right? Like you can listen to David Goggins on a podcast, or you can, whatever it is. But I think that's super important. And I think you bring up that consistency is so important. We're all going to fail. We're all going to gain weight and lose weight and gain weight and lose weight. Whether it's a lot of weight or a little weight, it's going to be variable, right? But I think the key is like, building that resiliency, and like you build it in a variety of different ways in life. So I'm a physician, you were a dentist, like you, an oral surgeon, you learn resiliency in one category, right? Like I can stay up and work and take care of patients on less sleep than most people, and I can make really complex decisions. But I may not be good at another area of my life, and that's okay, right? But like it's all building to overall becoming better in a variety of things. And that's why people say, like, if you start focusing on, let's say, weight loss, just one thing, you'll notice it sort of spreads through your whole life, whereas other things will also improve. And so I think it's just great to say, like, be consistent and keep working at it, and you'll get there.
Yeah, and particularly with fitness and nutrition, you bring up a good point there where you talk about weight loss versus some of the other things that we do. Let's say that you go into a situation, and I talk about this all the time with people when we start to get in around Halloween and then start to move in through the holiday season, because the reality is that probably only about 50% of people can really stick to a fat loss program through this time of year. But that's okay, because unfortunately, I think that many people who try to lose body fat, who think that that's their ultimate goal, I think that they spend too much time doing it. And so they grind against fat loss for like 6 months, and then they go off the rails for 2 or 3 months, and then they grind against fat loss for like another 6 months. And they don't value that time where they might have more fuel in their system to actually build some lean muscle that will get them to where that they wanted to be this entire time. And so switching mentality and seeing the benefits that you can have in all of these different seasons of life, no matter what your goals are, this is just a specific example for fitness and nutrition. But if you're going to be having more calories in your diet and you're going to say, hey, look, it's probably unrealistic that I'm going to continue to lose significant amounts of body fat. I'm probably not going to see the scale drop a whole lot. Say, okay, well, how about I make my life a lot easier and say, let's switch focus to building some lean muscle for the next few months. Then you relieve that stress of seeing the scale drop every 5 seconds. You start to value performance and health. You are not ignoring your ultimate goals if they are to be leaner, but you're taking it in different stages. And honestly, with things like building lean muscle, it's only going to help you lose body fat later and build your confidence in some other areas.
And improve your overall health. Right?
Oh, hugely.
Longevity.
I mean, and this is one of the things that I wanted to get into today when we were discussing some of the topics to talk about, but having more lean muscle and muscle mass is one of the best predictors of longevity and health that there possibly is. I mean, lean muscle is inversely and independently associated with longevity and health. Even when you factor out things like cardiorespiratory fitness, body fat, age, the total amount of smoking that a person does, like all of these different things we can factor out, and having more lean muscle and strength is a major benefit to longevity and health.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
It's funny because if you look at something like muscle mass index is one of the best predictors that we have of longevity and health, bar none. And it is much more accurate than something like BMI, which we've used for decades. And as doctors, this is not to get down on BMI, because BMI has a very real purpose as a general screening tool, and it works fine. But if we're going to be talking about maximizing longevity, health, injury risk reduction, our ability to handle metabolic disturbances, muscle mass index is probably much more relevant.
Yes, I completely agree. How does the average person estimate their muscle mass index?
You would have to get a CT scan. You would have to get it done by a doctor, and then it would be estimated for you. But you would ask your doctor, hey, I would like a muscle mass index scan, and it would do a CT. And typically what they'll do is a CT scan either of multiple parts of your body or just of your abdomen area, and then do an equation to predict where you are with that.
What about the sort of using a DEXA scan or those in-body type machines to help estimate your muscle mass?
So DEXA scans are okay. I mean, both of those are much less accurate than doing something like a CT or an MRI. DEXA scans are okay. They have an average error rate of about 3 to 4%. And so I get really hesitant when a client of mine comes up and they say, hey, I want to get DEXA scans or I want to get in-body scans. I get super hesitant with in-body scans, and I'll explain that in a minute. But DEXA scans, I get hesitant because if they have an error of 3 to 4%, and it goes in both directions. So you could be 20% body fat, and the DEXA scan could say you're 23, or it could say that you're 17. And so a person could get it. They could be actually at 20%, but it'll say 19. So it's one off. You come back the next time, and you're at 19, but it says 20, and you could be at something lower. You're lower than what it shows. So the issue with it is that if you're trying to use it as a marker of change over time, it's not the best marker because those errors are not standardized. And so people will say, oh, well, if it's got a 3 or 4% error, I'll just figure out that what it was, and then I'll just keep looking at subsequent, drawings, and then it'll be okay. But it doesn't actually work that way, since each error is different each time that you come in. It just is within that range. And so for DEXA, it is fine, and it's relatively accurate. And it's the reason that we use it as a gold standard in research, because it's relatively accurate. But for people that are attempting to do it, it is a very good idea not to take DEXA scans sooner than every 4 to 6 months. Preferably the longer that you can go out, the better. And you probably can't tell if anything is actually happening until you've maybe lost 3% body fat, because that's outside of that margin of error, right out at the margin of error.
Yeah.
So until that happens, you don't really know what's going on with the numbers that you're given. In body is even worse. It's up to 8%, and in some rare cases, 9 or 10. And so it is so far off that BMI is probably more accurate than an in body.
Okay.
And so there's a variety of reasons for why that is. In-body works by passing an electrical current through you, and the problem with the electrical current is that it finds different gradients, and sometimes, depending on where the pads are, it could pass through just your legs and miss your torso completely, or it could pass from one hand down to another leg and miss half the body. And so we have all these issues with in-body testing because it's super inaccurate. But the way that they sell it, because I know that people will say, well, I've looked at the in-body literature and there's a 1% margin of error. And this is similar to how DEXA does some of their stuff, but DEXA's is much better overall. When we look at the errors on a population level, the bigger errors counterbalance. And so if I've got like a +8 error and a -8 error, or a +8 error and a -1 error, that's 1% overall error. Because they push towards the middle. So the problem with it is we've got such large errors on both sides that on a population level, it looks great, because if you put enough people into an in-body scan, it's pretty accurate as an average.
Yeah, because there are studies, right, that say it's as good as DEXA, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and this is how they're pulling that off. They're pulling that off because they're using population averages. They're not pulling off individual metrics.
That's so interesting.
So when you look at individual metrics, it is a clusterfuck of just all over the place.
Wow. That's good. So this is where it's so important to be able to understand data analysis and analyze these studies well before you start talking about them on social media. Are you sick of going to the doctor only to have them talk at you for 15 minutes and leave without knowing exactly why they're prescribing you this certain medication and what exactly the next step is to take to optimize your health? Wouldn't it be great to finally find a doctor who actually listens to you, answers your questions, and doesn't rush you out the door? Well, at my practice, Rena Malik, MD, I aim to do just that. I specialize in taking care of patients who have issues with their sex lives, issues with their bladder, with their hormone health, or are having pain in their pelvic region or with sex. My goal is to give you the time and attention you deserve so you can leave with a clear understanding of your condition as well as our treatment plan that's optimized for your goals. During your visit, I'm 100% present with you for an entire hour. And after you leave, you can reach me. It is super easy to send me a message through our secure portal, and I'll get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. No questions asked, no hidden fees. Scheduling is easy. Just visit our website, renamalikmd.com/appointments. We see patients in both Irvine and Beverly Hills, California, and I see patients virtually in California, Florida, Illinois, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. Oh, and don't forget Texas. If you're outside these states, consider seeing me for an educational visit. I look forward to seeing you. You know, a lot of my audience is interested in sexual health, and I hope that through this podcast and my YouTube channel, I've convinced them that exercise and resistance training are essential to have good sexual health. But if you had a client that came to you and said, look, I just want to have the best sex in my life. I want to be able to last and endure right through a long sexual session, do different positions, potentially lift my partner or stay in a plank for a long period of time, whatever, right? Thrust,
Stay
really.
in a plank. I like where this is going. It's becoming very acrobatic.
Yeah. I want to be able to thrust really strongly.
Sure.
What would
Who doesn't?
What would be a exercise program that you would design for them?
I mean, you would essentially be doing the same standard training program as anybody that wants to build strength and health. And it's funny because people think that what you need to do is you have to have this very specific training program to do specifically what you want to do. But if you're hitting things comprehensively, it actually will do that. And it does that because functional fitness which is essentially what we're getting into, but this is functional for sex.
Yep.
Functional fitness works with two main things. There's two main ways to improve functional fitness. And this is where people get really confused because the term functional fitness has been essentially usurped as just a marketing ploy. And the reason that it has is because for something to be functional, two main things have to happen. One, you have to have motor control. And motor control is best done by performing the act itself. So if you want to get really good at tennis, you swing a tennis racket. You don't need to have a random cable attached to something and you're throwing your arm with a cable attached to it. Like, this is not the right way to train these types of people. For the motor control aspect, for the neurological aspect of the training, you do what you want to get better at. So go thrust. And that's, I'm essentially, we're prescribing people to go have sex, which is a great thing. But you want to get better at it because you say, hey, look, I want to have more endurance. I want to be stronger. I want to feel more confident while I'm doing this, right? The other aspect of functional training is if you take a muscle and you make it bigger and stronger, despite the fact that the neurological component does not transfer from an exercise that may be similar but not the same. So if we're, thrusting with a barbell on, it's not necessarily exactly the same as thrusting in bed. The neurological component is handled by actually doing it in bed. The building muscle part of the situation really aids in the functional fitness because a muscle that is bigger and stronger is better at every movement that muscle attempts. And you can build strength endurance in a similar manner. So if your goal is to, be better at a plank for a really long period of time or whatever it is, then you can build that in a very similar manner. But I think that people really get confused, and this works whether we're talking about sex or sports or whatever it is, because they think I need to be doing movements that only look exactly like what I want to be doing. When in reality, you should be doing what you want to be doing, and then you should be doing a proper strength training program that works the musculature that is involved in what you want to get better at doing.
Yeah. It's funny because you see a lot, especially on social media, you see
It's
people
nonsense.
doing weird exercises that no one is doing. And you're like, oh man, is that the move I should be doing? Because no one's doing that.
Yeah.
When in reality, like doing the standard template of exercises, like 20, 30 exercises that most commonly done are probably going to be the most bang for your buck.
The bread and butter exercises are going to absolutely be what you want to do. And I've had people that have attempted to work with me, and one guy that I can think of in particular was like, I want to get better at tennis. And I'm like, okay, how much do you play tennis? And he's like, 4 days a week. I'm like, all right, well, let's build a strength training program around, working the musculature of the upper body, the core musculature, and all these types of things. And he's like, well, none of these look like a tennis swing. I'm like, you're doing hundreds of tennis swings like
every week.
Yeah. And you don't need to do that because that's just superfluous at this point. I don't need to teach you motor control. You're already doing it. And if you're not completely whiffing every time you go to hit the ball, you're probably pretty good at it. And so, this idea of functional training has really been usurped by marketers to sell something. And like you said, you'll see that all the time on social media, because if you can make a nonsense looking exercise and then claim it does something, and logically, if you don't really understand how functional capacity is built, it would make sense. If I want to get better at lifting furniture, maybe I should deadlift. Well, yes, the strength component of it will help quite a bit with that. And that will certainly help. But if you want to be the best at lifting furniture, you go and you lift the actual furniture, because there are a lot more stability demands from the furniture. And this is a really shitty example, but this is just goes to show, there's this idea that like these specific exercises will carry over to this movement that I want to do, when in reality, there's no real carryover from that motor learning of something that's different to something that's even similar. It's not the same motor learning, but you will benefit from the fact that you might be working similar musculature. But rather than trying to focus on nonsensical exercises like randomly flailing around with like a cable to, mimic a throw or mimic whatever it is, you find the bread and butter exercises that actually stimulate that muscle optimally, because then you're going to get the best return for the functional movement that you want to do, that you're also working on neurologically.
Yes, I like that a lot. Where do you see, in someone who is really focused on either hypertrophy or strength, how does cardiovascular training add to that?
Cardiovascular training is necessary whether you want to become better at cardiovascular training or whether you just want to build muscle and size, muscle and strength. And this is something that I post about quite a bit, because I feel like I really need to reinforce that you guys need to get out and do some cardio, and particularly higher intensity cardio, because Both medium intensity cardio and higher intensity cardio will provide benefits for strength training. Higher intensity cardio seems to be a little bit better for strength and hypertrophy just because of the fact that it tends to increase cardiovascular health and build capillary density a little bit better than some of the other forms. Now, other forms of cardio certainly have benefits, like LIST, the low intensity steady state cardio, probably burns more calories overall than some of these other forms. But if we want to talk about specifically building muscle size and strength, the more intense forms of cardio from moderate up probably make the most sense because of their effects on mitochondria, because of their effects on capillary density, because of their effects on the cardiovascular system. But they're certainly very, very beneficial. And even people that, are straight power lifters or feel no need to have strength endurance, they're just maximal strength, will benefit from doing this type of thing.
To be honest, I didn't know that cardiovascular training had benefit for specifically just muscular growth, but it does. And so I think talking to the person who's like, I hate cardio, how do you build that in? Because I hate cardio.
People hate when I say this too. Cardio has never been easier than now. And cardio has never been easier than now because we have things like Netflix, Audible, we've got Spotify. We have all of these ways to make cardio very easy. And so when you're in high intensity interval training, you're not going to be able to do any of that outside of maybe Spotify because you just got music pumping and you're going. You're not paying attention to a TV show or a book when you're doing that. But for some of that medium intensity cardio where we're going for a jog or maybe a kind of a prolonged run, it has never been easier. You can listen to a book. You can watch a TV show that you were going to watch anyways. And even for people that are doing those things like LIST, the low intensity, just the walking, people will tell me, I need that time in the evening to relax and unwind. Okay, great. Hop on a treadmill. Do the exact same thing. Watch Netflix while you're doing it. Concurrent movement can be a very, very beneficial thing. And for people that have historically had some issues with cardio, there's two main ways that you do it. One, what we've been talking about here, where you take advantage of technology and you make it as easy and as fun as possible. And you don't have to love it. You don't have to love doing cardio, but if you can make it as painless as possible and enjoy the benefits, that's perfectly fine. The other thing that you can do is you can engage in different activities that can up that cardio level that you actually do enjoy. And, maybe you like to go play basketball. Maybe you can join a summer soccer league or whatever it is. But figuring out some way to make this as enjoyable as possible, or at least as less problematic as possible to get into, is a really good thing. And understanding that there are benefits for your physique, for, strength, lean muscle building, sexual health, all those types of things can be a really good kick in the ass to be able to get to do it.
Yes. Especially, we do know that actually they looked at aerobic exercise, 150 minutes a week, is as effective as like taking sildenafil for erectile dysfunction. So
not surprising.
You don't want to take a pill? Do some cardio.
Get the blood flowing.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about a little bit like nitty and gritty stuff about resistance training.
Sure.
Tell me about mental training. Mental
training is that's going to be specific to a person. Mental training is a very difficult thing to do. And it's also dependent on what you find value in and what you find challenges you. For some people, mental training, this is where you can get some benefits with things like the ice bathing that people really enjoy. You're probably not getting the recovery benefits. You're probably not getting the dopamine benefits that have been promised. But mental training can be beneficial from that. The same thing can be said whether we're doing resistance training, whether we're doing cardiovascular training.
So mental training meaning doing something really hard and challenging.
And finding value in it and accepting that the challenge is probably a lot of the benefit itself. That's one of those Marcus Aurelius quotes, the challenge is the way.
Yeah.
And it's really true, being able to find something that you find very difficult and attempting to overcome it is often the most rewarding thing that you can possibly do. And this is not specific to fitness and nutrition. Literally anything that kind of scares you, but will benefit you, that you go in head first, try to overcome, and then ultimately push through and succeed, is something that's going to improve this mental type of training.
And that's going to also subsequently improve your ability to push yourself harder during resistance training.
Sure. And there's a couple aspects to that. Learning to really push your intensity in resistance training is critical to get the benefits of resistance training. For strength training or to build lean muscle, there are two things that are necessary beyond the nutrition and sleep. with the strength training itself, you have to have adequate intensity, you have to be working near muscular failure, and you have to have adequate volume whenever you do it. So whenever you're setting up a program or whenever a coach is setting up a program for you, these are two things that they'll really take into account. And like you're getting at here with the mental training, when we look at the research that investigates intensity and where people are with intensity, the average person is about 5 reps away from failure when they think they're at failure. And so this is a problem because when a person first starts out their first year of training, we have that thing called newbie gains that most people have heard of. You are going to have the most accelerated gains in lean muscle progress as you're ever going to have. In this period, you can be slightly farther away from muscular failure on your working sets, and you will still stimulate muscle growth. As you become more trained, that window becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So realistically, as a person who's a beginner, you might be able to work at 3, 4, 5 reps away from failure. If you choose a weight and you take it until you can't go anymore, if you stop 3, 4, or 5 reps away from what you could really accomplish, you'll still probably grow a bit. The problem is as we progress, that becomes more strict. And then over time, it becomes 0 to about 2. And so people that don't learn to really push themselves mentally and literally emotionally through these periods tend to stall out their own progress. You won't build lean muscle. You won't cause the adaptations that you're actually trying to attempt to change because the intensity isn't there and it's not teaching your body, hey, I need to adapt to be able to overcome this.
So for a newbie, what is that feel like, getting 0 to 2 reps away from failure? Because I think a lot of people, myself included when I started, would work out and they're like, okay, I'm tired.
Yes. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. And that's a great question. So when people typically get started, I'll tell you what I do because this is one of the things that I teach people to get through. I don't tell them this is what it feels like because unfortunately, in my opinion, this is a very subjective experience, right? And if you grew up playing sports, if you grew up, like really learning to push yourself, you might have a different idea of what that feels like. You might know how to push yourself through that discomfort. And I usually find that people that I work with that have done high school and college sports, people that have done semi-professional work, the semi-professional athletes, they have a better idea of where their maximum ceiling is. For people that are just getting into training, you're not going to have any idea where your maximum ceiling is. And the reality is most people quit at about 80%. So what I will typically do is I will tell people, okay, here's the plan. I want you to run this and we're going to run it for a month or 2. And I just let them go off and do their own thing. There's so many things that they need to learn at this point. We need to get consistency down. We need to get used to, a training system that they've never done before. We need to get through that period in the beginning where they're having really increased levels of delayed onset muscle soreness. And so telling a person, let's start going to failure when they're first starting out is probably a recipe for discouraging them and maybe in really rare cases, rhabdomyolysis. And so I want to preface this with this conversation because when people are first starting out and they're listening to us talk about this, I want them to give themselves a break in the beginning and just get used to doing the motions, just get used to doing the exercises. Once you get a little bit of experience under your belt, 2, 3, 4 months in, maybe a little bit longer if you're taking the scenic route. What I like to do is I like to set up something called an intensity check with my clients. Now, like I said, if you're a beginner, I would set your reps in reserve, the distance away from failure for the majority of the working sets that you do at about 2 to 3. As you become more advanced, 0 to 2 becomes a good goal. So what you can do is something called an intensity check. And say that you have a program that says, okay, we're going to be doing 10 sets of this. Now, we've been doing this for 2 to 3 months. You've been keeping a logbook. We know what weight you think that you should be doing for these 10 sets. Time to do an intensity check. Warm up, take that weight that's in your logbook, look at it and say, okay, I think that I should be doing this bench press for 150 pounds. I've been getting 10 with this. I think as this beginner that I am, that I'm 2 to 3 reps away from failure. Okay, cool. Take it out until momentary muscular failure. Go until you fail mid-rep. Obviously get a spotter so this is safe. Tell them what you're going to do. Say, look, I'm intentionally taking this to a point where I'm trying to fail, where I'm going to, press up and I'm not going to get it there and it's going to start to come back down and then help me get it off. Then write down the number of reps that you got. If we're working at 2 to 3 reps in reserve and we were getting 10, then theoretically you should be getting 12 or 13. If you get 14 or more, You've just proven to yourself that you were lifting too light.
Right.
And that you weren't in that range that you thought that you were. And so by setting these tests up periodically, you can figure out what it feels like to be at that level of discomfort that is close to failure, that it is necessary to actually push the growth that you're trying to achieve. And so when you say, what does it feel like? I don't know. What does it feel like for you? And so that's the question that you'll never be able to explain that to a person, because it's going to feel different to a 70-year-old woman than it's going to feel to a 15-year-old boy.
Right.
And so by doing these tests, setting out the expectations, giving them the guidelines of, okay, look, this is where we want you working. This is what our overall plan looks like, or you can set up your own plan and then start to use some of the guidelines that we're talking about here. And then periodically take yourself to momentary muscular failure and see where you are and then adjust accordingly. In some cases, you might find that you were lifting too much. All of a sudden, you're not lifting as much as you thought that you were.
Yeah.
Or maybe you just weren't being really honest with yourself when you were doing those working sets, and you had planned it for 10 reps, but you were always getting 7, and you're like, this is good enough. And that's fine if you're progressing and you're doing okay. But if you really want to dial in a program, you do these intensity checks periodically. And I recommend them probably once every 2 months, 3 months. Mm-hmm. And then you don't do it on every exercise, but you figure out, okay, well, which ones do I have my biggest question on? Which one am I unsure if I'm getting, really close to my ability?
Yeah.
And then take a week and do that. Take one each day. And that's usually how I do it with my clients. I'll say, okay, day 1, I want you to do this exercise. Day 2, I want you to do this exercise. Day 3, this exercise. And at the end of the week, send me an email with the exercise name, the number of reps that you got, and the weight that you used. And I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, is this in line with the programming specifics that we had? And then how do we adjust this? And over time, you're going to start to feel what it actually feels like to get into those areas of discomfort that you're going to need to push through. And discomfort is not a bad thing. And this is something that you were hinting at earlier. Discomfort is often the way. There's a difference between acute stabbing or neurological pain, in like your joints and in your musculature, and the deep down muscle soreness or that chronic soreness that is probably something that having from time to time is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Because it really means you're pushing yourself.
What about optimizing time under tension? So I think, there's a lot of data on the value of eccentric contraction and, maximizing time under tension. So what is the truth? Where does the truth lie?
I'm smiling because it's a beautiful question, and it's a very nuanced answer, and it's something that is very misunderstood. Time under tension. Typically, people will misinterpret time under tension. They think that time under tension is tempo. Mm-hmm. And tempo meaning if I'm lifting, let's say I'm doing a bicep curl, the concentric is this much time, hold at the top is this much time, eccentric is this much time, hold at the bottom is this much time.
Right.
It's not really time under tension. That's tempo. And so what people will get at is that if I really slow down the eccentric, I'm going to get much better results. Now, time under tension is true, but time under tension, the way that we are describing it is usually a misunderstanding of the force velocity curve. And what the force velocity curve shows is when we're lifting towards proximity to failure, the entire conversation that we just had, which is why this is a perfect lean into. When we're lifting towards proximity to failure, like we should be, the reps are going to slow down. Actin myosin filaments take a lot longer to cross bridge, and your muscle, even if you're trying to pump it as fast as you possibly can, it's going to slow. And people experience this without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
Lift the heaviest weight that you possibly can, and then lift the lightest weight that you possibly can. There's going to be a real difference in that amount of speed that you can lift that, and it's because of that actin myosin cross bridging. And so what time under tension is really doing is it's teaching people to get more towards that end of intensity that we wanted them to get at. The problem that we're having there is that time under tension likely makes sense when we look at it as how long are we under tension over an entire workout, not how long are we under tension over a single set, or a single rep.
Yeah.
And so the issue with the rep viewpoint is that when you look at the research, any rep tempo, total rep tempo from 2 to 8 seconds builds lean muscle in the exact same manner based on current research.
Okay.
So I could be 1 second up, 1 second down. Build it the same as 4 seconds up, 4 seconds down.
Oh my gosh.
It builds it the exact same way. Now here's the difference. you have to control the eccentric to some extent to get the benefits that you're talking about.
Right.
So when you talked about, hey, people want to slow down the eccentric, it's true. You do need to control the eccentric. If you just dive bomb it, you're not going to get the same benefits.
Right.
But 1 to 2 seconds of control for the eccentric is all that is necessary to maximize lean muscle return.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because recently my husband has been really pushing me to slow down and I am dying. I am literally dead.
So there are some instances where maybe you would slow it down.
Yeah.
They tend to be sports specific applications. They tend to be if you have a movement that maybe you don't feel it quite right, and maybe you're trying to learn to get into a right movement pattern, and maybe that's a way to be able to get you to slide into that movement pattern a little bit better. But it's not specifically for hypertrophy. You're doing it for other reasons.
Right.
Now, when you look at that the same grouping of research, if you take a time for a rep greater than 10 seconds, it's actually worse for hypertrophy. Which is why I said 2 to 8 seconds seems to be maximizing. Going more than 10, and you'll see people do these like really slow eccentrics.
Yeah.
And you're like, what are you doing? And they think that it's working more, and they think it logically, and it does make sense logically, because it makes you more sore.
Right.
But see, this is why I always talk about sticking that eccentric to 1 to 2 seconds, because the longer that you go in the eccentric, yes, it makes you more sore. Soreness is not an indicator of muscle growth. And so this is where people get really confused, because they'll think, well, I'm more sore, so it feels like the exercises that I did were more effective.
Right.
No, you've literally taken more time to make yourself more sore for the same benefits.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand the scientific reason why 10 seconds would be worse than 8 seconds.
I think the fatigue buildup
Okay.
starts to come into play. I mean, then this is me spitballing at this point, but I
Right.
think that the fatigue buildup starts to come into play, because really, I mean, that soreness that you start to get,
You probably can't get as many reps in.
yeah, I think that that's what it does. It affects the overall workout for the day. And so even if you're going longer and you're getting more sore, maybe your subsequent sets you're having to go down in weight if you're going to try to stay within that same set and rep range and the same RIR, the reps in reserve, away from. So I think that what you're ended up doing is you're affecting the quality of the rest of your work.
Got it.
And this is also why we see, are you familiar with German volume training?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is why we see German volume training not really doing a great job.
Got it. Yeah. Makes sense.
It's too much. And there is a sweet spot to where, like, you want to be in a certain volume range to make things work. But just like with, even things like body fat, I mean, too low is bad, too high is bad. Volume in training is a similar thing. Too low, you're not going to get the stimulus that you want. Too high, and you're just overdoing it.
Yeah. I mean, you're probably increasing your cortisol to levels that are actually going to create more harm than good.
I mean, that would be very difficult in a normal person, and usually the cortisol spikes from weight training and exercise are beneficial. And actually, it's one of the weird things that if you look at acute hormone spikes from exercise, cortisol is more closely related to lean muscle building than even testosterone and growth hormone. So we have this whole idea of cortisol as always being a bad thing, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing, especially under the umbrella of when it's being induced by exercise itself. But to your point, it's still an unnecessary. I mean, it just doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
And so you're really kind of hurting yourself from a time perspective, a soreness perspective. I mean, maybe this is good from that mental training that you're talking about. Really beat yourself up.
This is
hard. That Navy SEAL training
really hard.
where like you're really beating yourself down, and there are benefits to challenging yourself mentally, certainly.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of mentally challenging ourselves in ways that are also super productive. I mean, I want to maximize the return for the time that we put in, because, when we're talking to Gen Pop, they got shit to do. You don't want to be around all day doing these super long training programs, doing these things that are unnecessary. And that's why talking about proper volumes, proper intensities, let's get in and get out in the most efficient way possible and actually start to progress, as opposed to constantly doing these like massive amounts of circuit training or the functional fitness that is not necessarily giving us exactly what we want to do, or all the other nonsense that's out there. And so the questions that you're asking here are beautiful questions, because they're exactly what people screw up without realizing that they're screwing it up.
I've heard that despite following a standard strength program from your research that you shared on social media, despite following a standard strength program, 1 in 4 people will not see improvement in muscle mass.
Oh,
That's a lot of people.
Yeah, that's the non-responders to resistance training is about 25%. 50% will experience normal growth patterns. 25% will experience very quick growth. And 25% will experience next to none. Now, it's not none, but
Right.
they're still determined as non-responders. Now, they experience strength growth. It's the lean muscle building that tends to be much lower for these people. And that's a discouraging situation to be in.
Can you be a non-responder in just one part of your body and other parts will gain? Like, some
You can
guys
be.
will say, I don't grow my biceps, but everything else grows really well. Or
You can be. The problem with these anecdotes is that you talk to these guys and you're like, well, okay, well, how much time are you spending doing this one? And they're like, oh, it's kind of an afterthought to this, or oh, I haven't had my nutrition under control, or oh, I haven't had my sleep under control, which is a really big thing as far as lean muscle growth goes. And so you have to essentially get rid of all of these cofactors that could become problems to prevent the growth, and then assess whether or not they're actually in this 25%.
so what do you do if you're in that 25% and you've dialed in your sleep, you've dialed in your nutrition?
Then you actually have to up volume from the traditional recommendations that we give. When we look at the volume, if you look at the breadth of the research, it suggests that to maximize lean muscle gains, you want 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week.
Okay.
Now, it varies within that. When you look at higher volume research, there's technically nothing wrong with going higher volume. We actually see increased gains the higher volume that you go. The problem with it is you massively hit diminishing returns at about 20. Now, we just had a major systemic review come out about a month or two ago that actually said that it was about 18. But looking at all the data, I still like to say 10 to 20. But if people want to argue and say it's 10 to 18 or 12 to 18, that's fine.
Sure.
If another professional says that, that's fine. The problem is that diminishing return kicks in around that point. And so we're getting 97, 98% of what we're going to be getting at 20 sets, working sets per week. This is not counting your warm-ups. And I have to emphasize that for everybody that's getting new to training and wants to start out. When you have this inability, this so-called inability to really build lean muscle mass, one of the best things that you could possibly do is up that volume. And you might be above that 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week. And they've shown progress in the studies as high as, I think it's 42 or 43.
Wow.
But the reason that I don't jump on this as a first stop answer is because if you're spending the time to do 40 sets for a muscle group in a week, I mean, you're going to be in the gym for like 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
And so this might not be feasible for the large majority of people simply because of the time commitment that it puts in. So what I would say is start with that 10 to 20, set up your programs however you would like to do the 10 to 20, and then go from there. But make sure that you're spending at least 6 months consistently with proper nutrition, proper sleep in play, because these are very major determinants on whether or not that this would work. And I would be willing to bet, even in these studies that suggest that it was 25%, they did not have full control over nutrition. They did not have full control over sleep. So having said that it's 25%, that's exactly what the study suggests. But reality might be a little bit different. It may be a lot lower than what that is. And maybe some of these ancillary things are the reasons that we're seeing it so high. Because, I mean, how many people do you know that aren't super diligent on staying, on top of their nutrition, or particularly their sleep?
Sleep is, yeah. I mean, everyone
Sleep is huge.
Yeah.
And I mean, have you looked at the research with that? It's pretty profound how much that affects hormones, how much that affects lean muscle building, how much that affects fat loss.
It's one of the most modifiable things that we have control over that people refuse to do.
Yeah, every time. And I bring it up. And what actually I do is I tend to give guys a punch in the balls on it. And so what I do is I point out the fact that testosterone in people that have 6.5 hours, it's either 6 or 6.5 versus 8 hours, can be as much as 50% lower.
Yeah.
And so if you want to talk about sexual health and some of the benefits to your regular listeners, get some sleep.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to make a massive difference in your sexual health.
Yes, that and stress are two of the ones that I
Major.
think people refuse to acknowledge or manage, but they, are huge contributors to hormone health and and ultimately sexual health. Quick break from this episode to let you know I am so grateful that you're spending part of your day with me. I started creating content online to empower people to learn more about their bodies without needing to go see a doctor, pay a copay, wait in a waiting room, or find parking. And it has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. If you want to help support our mission of providing free education, please consider joining our premium membership. There you will have access to ad-free episodes, which are released early, as well as free transcripts and the opportunity to ask me anything. And these questions are answered in our monthly AMA episodes. Support the show and join today at renamalik.supercast.com. Can't wait to see you there. Let's talk a little bit about rest periods.
Sure.
So how do you determine what is optimal rest? Like, when are you losing benefit because you're resting too long, or when are you not optimizing your set because you're resting too short?
When we look at the research for this, it's pretty interesting because I think that the majority of people probably rest too little between sets. I mean, if we're looking at the literature, it suggests that for most sets, we should probably be resting between 1.5 minutes and 2 minutes between sets. Now, this is going to be modified based off of whether it's a compound exercise or not a compound exercise, whether it is a very low rep, high weight, or higher rep, lower weight type of exercise. If we're doing unilateral exercises, isolation exercises rather, and we're doing higher reps, it probably makes more sense to be at about 1 minute to 1.5 minutes. And that's perfectly fine. If we're doing the majority of our work where we're sitting in between the 6 to 12 rep range, which is what you're probably going to be sitting in if hypertrophy is your goal, then we're going to be sitting at maybe 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes or so. If you're going to be doing strength work where you're sitting at 1 to 5 reps, really heavy weight, you may be up to 3, 4, maybe even 5 minutes between sets. And this is where you start to see powerlifters camping in the squat rack with the gummy bears and everything like that, because it literally takes the time for your body to recover to be able to handle another really heavy set.
Yeah.
And people make this mistake because I guess they want to get their workout done a little bit quicker. And if that's the way that you can get in and get things done, that's fine. You're still going to have benefits. But if you really want to maximize your return, you start to follow a little bit more of the rest periods that have some more substance to them, because they're going to give you the ability to actually recover in between the set and not be as fatigued when you go on to your following sets.
Is there a gender variation in rest periods?
Technically there is. I can't give you a number, but what I can tell you is women recover faster.
That's what I've been told. That's why I was curious.
Were you hoping that I was going to say that?
Well, I wanted to, confirm that was accurate, but I still take my rest period.
Yeah. So women can technically recover faster. However, we don't have the data to say exactly where within that period that would be optimal, because the reality is most of our information is in men. It's getting a lot better, but we don't know exactly where that is. And if I were to give an anecdotal answer, I would say maybe cut your rest periods by about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Compared to what I was recommending before. But you don't even have to do that. And I mean, taking a little bit longer than what I've recommended is probably better than taking shorter.
Got it.
So if we want to say 2 minutes is our good standard for rest periods, if a woman wants to take 2 minutes and she would have normally been okay at 1:15, 1:30, it's not going to hurt you in any way outside of just taking a little bit more time at the gym.
Yeah, got it. That's good. That's helpful. Warm-up sets. You said, not including do you have to warm up? Are you going to hurt yourself if you don't warm up?
Do you have to warm up? You probably should warm up. However, we probably shouldn't be doing warm-ups the way that we see a lot of people doing warm-ups. Warm-ups should probably take 10 to 15 minutes max.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be some ridiculous 45-minute thing on, a foam roller with a lacrosse ball with bands. Like it doesn't need to be that way. When we look at the research around warm-ups, it's a little bit hazy. We don't have the greatest research there. I mean, it probably helps get the blood flowing and make you a little bit more limber for your movements and everything like that. And I think that that's probably a really good thing before getting under heavy load, particularly if we're going to make those working sets working towards proximity to failure, right? It's probably a really good idea to do a warm-up. Whether that warm-up is, going for a jog for 5 minutes and then doing 1 or 2 sets of whatever the movement is that you're going to start with, and just progress up a little bit in weight each time. That's perfectly fine. If you have a pre-existing injury or you're doing a sport that is highly technical And the one that comes to mind is like maybe Olympic weightlifting. It's going to take you a little bit longer. But they're probably not the people that need the answer of how long should I be warming up, because they're doing they're doing a very technical and specific sport. And so, those people have a little bit of an understanding of maybe they should be taking a little bit longer. But for the large majority of us, 10, 15 minutes max is probably all you need. And once you do this, please don't feel like you need to do warm-ups for every movement that uses similar musculature. And I've seen this in some of my clients, and I'm like, what are you doing that's making this take 4 hours to work out?
Yeah.
Because they'll have back squat, and they'll take 15 minutes to warm up for back squat, and then they'll have lunges the next, and they'll take 15 minutes to warm up for lunges. I'm like, you just did legs. Your legs are warm.
Yeah.
Just go right into it.
Yeah.
So I know that that's probably almost a stupid thing for a lot of people to say, for a lot of people to hear. But I think that I want to emphasize that because it can save the people that could get caught up into that a lot of time.
Yeah. And that is a lot of time. Do you need to stretch?
No.
Okay.
Do I need to stretch? No. So we're talking about static stretching to improve mobility and flexibility.
Yeah.
This is a fun conversation. Can it help static stretching? Yes, it can help increase flexibility, particularly for beginners. It can be a really good thing to start to get into a static stretching routine. It can be part of the thing that builds your habits and your routines for getting used to the gym. It can expedite some of those benefits of flexibility. But over time, and particularly when you become an intermediate lifter, you really don't need to stretch anymore. And before I explain this, people are going to have a very visceral reaction to this comment. Every time I bring this up and talk about the research, people get really angry. When you look at static stretching, and you look at resistance training taken to end ranges of motion, and whenever you're doing the large majority of the exercises that you should be doing, you should be taking it as far as your mobility comfortably allows. When people talk about squats, some people will say, always ass to grass. Some people will say, stop at 90 degrees. The answer is neither of those. It's go as low as you can that's comfortable, and then continue to work on that. And what we've seen in the research is if you take loaded movements to end ranges of motion, it increases flexibility at the same extent as a dedicated stretching routine.
I don't know why people would be so upset. I'm like excited about that.
I know, it's awesome. You don't have to stretch them.
Right, yeah.
It's the greatest thing ever. It's like I just saved myself so much time that I can now like prep food or do something else.
I'm really happy to hear that because I don't stretch. But
you know what's great? You now have time for cardio.
Yeah, I guess
I've just ruined your life.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I do a lot of low intensity, steady state. I need to add that high intensity.
Yeah. So the other thing that's really cool about this is that when we talk, and the other argument that people will say is, well, I want to stretch because then I'll be less prone to injury. And unfortunately, I get to drop the hammer there too. When you look at the research on it, there are 3 major systemic reviews that have looked at injury reduction risk. Static stretching itself seems to reduce injury risk anywhere between 0 and 4%. Okay. It's next to nothing. When we look at strength training, it's upwards of 69%. So not only can we motivate people to get into strength training because it's going to increase longevity, it's going to increase quality of life, it's going to make you more metabolically thrifty, it's going to do all of these other benefits, bone health, cardiovascular health, brain health, and it's going to be the number one thing that you can do to reduce injury risk. And this reduction in injury risk is independent of body fat levels. So even if you're a heavier guy and you have more muscle, you are much less injury prone than a leaner person that doesn't have muscle. I mean, think of NFL linemen. They're big people that if they weren't getting hit constantly would probably be much less injury prone than the average person because of their muscle mass.
Yeah.
So there are so many benefits to doing this. And I love being able to point out that, unlike what our 80s and 90s gym coaches used to tell us, it's probably not that important to static stretch, and it probably doesn't reduce injury risk all that much, if at all.
But I think they still do it. Like, I think I still see my son in basketball practice stretching. I mean, I don't hang out with him anymore. I go to the gym when he practices basketball. But when he was little, they would stretch, like, still. Now,
I'm not against dynamic stretches before working out. I mean, that can be part of a warm up if you like to do that, because it can get blood flowing. It can get you in through those ranges of motion. Static stretching, I don't tend to recommend before weight training or other activities such as that, because it can decrease power output. Now, that power output decrease only lasts about 5 to 10 minutes, but if people static stretch for 30 minutes and then they immediately start to lift weights, it's probably not the most advantageous thing for them. It's probably a waste of time.
I always ask this because my dad is older. I took him to the gym and he's like, oh my God, I'm so scared of hurting myself. And, I told him, let's just start. Let's just start. Overall, this is going to help you, be able to get off the toilet in 15 years and not have
prevent you from having to do it.
Yeah. And, but I think there's a lot of older guys who worry about hurting themselves when
Sure.
they start going to the gym. So what are some best practices to avoid that?
The best practices for this is the same best practices as you use in many cases with rehab. And so this conversation will be good for people that have some nagging injuries and they're just trying to get back into things, or if you have that concern of, if I do this is going to be problematic. First, understand that, like we just talked about, if your concern is injury risk, you need to lift some damn weights. I mean, that's the number one thing that will help you here. Mm-hmm. And on top of the injury risk from, muscle issues, I mean, it's going to increase bone health. It's going to increase bone density. And so for women, particularly when you're going through menopause, I mean, what is one of the main issues that we have after menopause is we've got osteoporosis start to kick in.
Yeah.
So the right way to do this, one, please get a coach if you have any questions. And this is not a self-serving thing. This is just logical. You want somebody to be able to provide you with a program that you can progress in a logical manner, because the real answer to this is start low, go slow, start to build up. If you have this concern in play, particularly if you have pre-existing injuries, particularly if you have complicating health problems, maybe your doctor has told you that you have low bone mineral density. Okay, well, maybe our conversation before about being 1 to 2 reps away from reserve is not the right conversation for you right now, because you're going to break in half. So maybe what we do is we start lower. We still do very similar exercises to what was done before. Again, we go back to the bread and butter. It's always these really important base exercises. And if you want to say it's like 20 to 30 or whatever it is, I mean, it's somewhere, but it's somewhere around there, right?
Yeah.
And if we can get people to start doing these, and like I said when we were talking about building intensity, just get in, just start going, and just go until where you feel like you're challenging yourself a little bit, and then do 2 or 3 more reps from where you start to feel like you're challenging yourself. Even for people that have this concern that they are a little bit more injury prone, if they're choosing the right exercises to do this, maybe you start out with some of those, machine-based exercises just to start to get your body used to having some load or some, a different stimulus than what you've had before. And then you start to progress it up to free weights or whatever it is that you want to do. The right move is to get in there, literally just start going.
Yeah.
And then build that up over time. And you're using that progressive overload principle. And you're using that progressive overload principle, whether you're an 18-year-old kid that wants to build as much lean muscle as possible, or you're an 80-year-old person that just wants to live longer and live better. I mean, if you just want to pick up your grandkid, you're going to use the same tactics that the person that's 18-year-old uses. And this is irrespective of gender. Mm-hmm. And this is a really important thing, because there's a lot of really bad information out there right now that is telling women that they're broken, that you have to do these things like cycle syncing, that you have to do these things like training differently when you're post-menopause. And that is not what the research shows.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to go over with this with anybody that wants to message me, because I know that there's a lot of pushback about this kind of thing, but I've written about this constantly. I did some things with Amanda Thebe and Jen Gunter, and talking about the research that's out there about this. And it almost seems, I guess, annoying for a man to be pushing that message. But what I really wanted to get across is this is not saying that you don't face challenges, because the experience of going through menopause is certainly different than anything a man will ever go through. Mm-hmm. You're going to have less sleep. You're going to have cramps. You're going to have hot flashes. You're going to have all these other issues that you're dealing with that this other person isn't dealing with. But the same things work to get you through that as it worked prior to menopause. And this has been shown in the research. And so if we know that, at least we can say, hey, look, whether I'm 18 or whether I'm 80, whether I'm going through menopause, whether I'm not, if my entire idea with when I train is to set up a proper plan, get the right intensity, progress it well over time, don't make massively drastic jumps that I can't handle, do it to where I can handle it and get better and better over time, and then I auto-regulate, then we can really start to make progress in our health, our lean muscle building, and our strength. And by auto-regulating, I mean cycle syncing is stupid as hell. You don't have 2 weeks out of the entire month where you're essentially broken and can't do anything. You might say, hey, look, I didn't sleep last night because I was sweating the entire time, and today I feel like crap. Great. In your logbook, you said you lifted 100 pounds last week. Let's drop that down to 85 and do what we can do.
Right.
What would a guy do if he pulled an all-nighter because of work or 2-a-day shift or whatever it was? Look back on that logbook, drop down to 85 pounds, do what you can do.
Yeah.
And this auto-regulating is what we really want to push in these situations because, yes, women are facing these challenges that men don't face, and you certainly have to address them. But at the same time, you don't preemptively just give up and say, I'm only strong this part of the month and I'm not strong this part of the month.
Yeah.
That's not what happens.
You're leaving a lot on the table then.
Right. And that's not what the research shows anyways.
Right. Yeah. And I'm menopause certified. I've actually reviewed the research on, this correlation with hormone therapy and weight loss. And it is not like a be all end all, right?
No.
It is helpful maybe in a small subset of people, potentially. Yes. There is some data to suggest.
It's helpful more for sex than it is for anything else.
It's helpful for hot flashes. The most important thing is hot flashes and bone health, right?
Sure.
And then, yes, vaginal estrogen will be helpful for vaginal tissues and all those things.
I would think the joint health, too, with the drops in
joint
estrogen.
health. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's going to help with all those things. But it is not a panacea for weight loss, right? And I think that I think that the point that a lot of people want to make is that hormone replacement therapy has a lot of benefits, right?
Sure.
And they're trying to sell it in a multitude of different ways because, yes, it is beneficial and it's had a really bad name associated with it for many, many years because of misinterpretation of data and a lot of issues that have gone on. We've talked about it on this podcast before, but I think it's important for everyone to realize, women, men alike, that you still have to train, you still have to work out, you still have to strength train, you still have to exercise. And I think everybody would agree with that statement. And you can't say, oh, I'm postmenopausal, it's done, I can't gain muscle, or I can't exercise anymore the same, or I can't, you still have to work towards progressive overload.
There's not a workout that's like, this is the workout that works for menopausal, and this is the workout that works for not menopausal. But it's being sold that way, as if, hey, look, this is the menopausal workout. It's not different.
Yeah.
You're adjusting maybe your volume, you're adjusting maybe, but this is based on how you're feeling, not based on what you're hearing your hormones are doing.
Yes. And honestly, I think cycle syncing or whatever, tracking your cycle is stressful in and of itself.
It's pointless.
I wouldn't, there's no reason I would ever do that. You know what I mean? I notice sometimes I don't feel up to it, but I'm I don't have a menses because I have an IUD, but I don't know when I am in my cycle, nor would I stop doing something. I would just go to the gym and lift a little lighter.
Well, so do you notice throughout your month, that, every 2 weeks you don't have any strength?
No.
And so I think that this is a really big problem because with the whole idea of cycle syncing, that's what we're telling people. We're instituting nocebo, not us, but these other people are instituting nocebo. You're telling somebody that they're going to have these massive strength drops and that they're going to last a really long time and that you need to train differently because of it. And what are we doing? We're essentially breaking people.
And there's people saying you should make certain decisions around this time of your cycle. You should, first of all, that is really harmful, right? If I'm a surgeon, what am I not supposed to operate for 2 months of the, no, 2 weeks of the month? No, that's insane.
She's feeling bad. It's her time off.
Yeah. But what does that say about women, right? What are we portraying women as this fragile, we can't do anything, we can't take care of things?
I think what we're doing, when I look at things like the menopausal charlatans, the ones that are pushing, post-menopause, things are a lot different. It's inevitable that you're going to lose muscle mass. It's inevitable that you're going to put on a whole lot of body fat. I mean, when we look at the research and you actually account for age, it doesn't seem to be that way. I think what is ending up happening is it's just a really good way to market this. And so what we're doing is we're seeing women who are experiencing something that they've never experienced in their life, the population that is essentially falling for this. And I don't want this to seem bad. I just have a lack of a better word, because when you're experiencing this, you're having something that's never happened to you in your entire life. You're not sleeping. You're having these hot flashes. You're irritable, whatever else is going on in your life. Well, logically, wouldn't you think that if you start to see yourself gain some body fat, that would be a really good scapegoat, instead of realizing that because I wasn't sleeping, because I was feeling like crap, I was eating a lot more Oreos. I wasn't training as much as I was before because I've been told that this is an inevitable outcome. And so what's the point of me putting forth this effort?
Yeah.
And we see that when people actually put forth the effort, this doesn't happen. I mean, we do see declines, but they are age-related declines. They are not declines based on menopause status.
Right.
And so if we can get that message out there, I think that we can empower a lot of people. We really went off on a tangent.
We did. Well,
But it's such a thing that like it really irks me to see this, because I think that so many women are being taken advantage of. And all I want to do is continue to push that message out there that you have the power to take control of this. And yes, it will be more challenging. But as long as you know that you can do it, that can be the impetus that you need to take those steps.
Absolutely. And the last point is, during menopause, you are at that phase in your life where you're probably mid-career if you're working. Your kids are probably of the age where they have, real stressors in their life. I mean, they may be young. So now that we are aging, women are having children at an older age. But most of the time, they're at an age where they have a lot of demands. They have a lot of things going on. They have after school activities and things, whatever. And then your parents are aging. So there's a lot going on in life too during that time.
Yeah. I mean, this is the type of same thing with you, that you see with metabolism. I mean, metabolism holds steady between age 20 and 60. It does not drop. Your metabolic rate does not drop. And yet if you tell people this, and this is based off of Ponzer data of one of his big studies, but if you tell people this, they get almost personally offended because they're like, I gained a lot of weight in my 30s. And yeah, you probably did, because you had a full-time job and you had kids and you had, it's these ancillary things that make it seem like that logical outcome is what's happening.
It's all that NEAT activity, right? That non-exercise activity. So I have an 8-year-old and he will be moving I actually pay attention. He doesn't sit and he moves all day long.
Put a step counter on him.
He used to, but then he got obsessed with it. So he would run around and walk like this. He would shake it around. And so I was like, okay, we're not gonna do that anymore. But he moves all day long, and I have to make myself get up and move, right? After a long day, I've operated, I've taken care of my patients, I've taken care of my social media stuff. I'm at the end of the day, I gotta be I gotta walk on this track. It's not neat anymore. It's exercise. They have to actually get up and do it, right? But when you're younger, you just move more. Yeah. I trained in New York City. We walked everywhere. We moved so much. So yeah, you could eat a bunch of slices of pizza and still maintain your weight because you were walking a lot more.
I mean, it's amazing what NEAT accounts for, and I don't think that people realize that. Mm-hmm. I mean, NEAT, for those who are not familiar with it, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is basically a fancy way to say all the movement that we do that's not dedicated exercise, it can account for up to 2,000 calories on a day. Now, that is in an extreme example when you have something like an agricultural job, but it could be as low as 300 or 400 calories a day for somebody that's really sedentary. And so I will get clients and I'll look at them and I'll be like, we'll monitor step count as a proxy for NEAT just to see what's going on. Mm-hmm. And because NEAT tends to take hits as they lose body fat, and that's one of the ways that your body stabilizes you and installs you out. It's an intentional thing because it thinks you're starving. So when we're monitoring NEAT, we'll see, hey, look, you're at 2,000 steps a day. That's very sedentary. And if we can get people up to 8,000 steps, which is very doable for most people once you start to mentally make it a priority, all of a sudden that issue that they had with losing weight starts to go away and they start to progress and they're actually able to eat something beyond a cracker and some water per day.
Absolutely. Are you feeling in a rut in the bedroom? Wishing you had the kind of sex life you could brag about? I've spent years helping patients and creating content for people all around the world to improve and optimize their sex life. Today, you can get my knowledge for 100% free with my new ebook called Better Sex, Better Life. In this ebook, I review my top 10 tips for improving your sex life, all from the comfort of your own home. All you have to do is go to renamalikmd.com/morepleasure to download it for free today. So now let's talk about nutrition. And I want to start with talking about protein. And I think that there's guideline that we need to address. When you look at the guidelines for protein intake, the U.S. guidelines would say that 0.8 grams per kilogram is the recommended amount, which is not very much. Yeah. And then the ceiling of which is 1.6 grams per kilogram, after which eating more is not going to be helpful.
I don't agree with that. And so what we will typically hear from fitness professionals is 1 gram of protein daily per pound of ideal body weight. And there's nothing wrong with this. It is a good general recommendation. It promotes good amounts of lean body mass. It promotes good body composition. It works on a variety of populations. I mean, this or 1 gram of protein per centimeter of body height are both really good recommendations because they work across a large proportion of people. I mean, even the obese. If I'm giving a recommendation and the goal is to maximize lean muscle building return and body composition and overall health, it's a little bit more nuanced. Now, that doesn't mean that I disagree with another professional that says 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. I fully support them in saying that because it's great and it's easy to remember, and there's a reason that they use that because it is easy to remember. The answer is a little bit more nuanced, and the answer is a little bit more nuanced because there are different situations which can modify that, and particularly if we're trying to maximize lean muscle building return, it may be a bit different. If we look at the research, it's anywhere between 0.72 and about 1.5 grams of protein daily per pound of body weight. Now, this is not appropriate for the obese because that would have them taking in massive amounts of protein that they just can't possibly eat. So I would use one of the 2 previous recommendations. But this varies based on body composition, age, whether you're in a calorie surplus or deficit, goals, and your personal preferences. The lower end of that range, about 0.72 to 1 gram, is a very appropriate recommendation for pretty much everybody in general population and those at maintenance or above. You can technically take in more than that. If you take in more than that, it might confer some benefits for body composition. We've got a lot of anecdotal research, and we've got a lot of research looking at things like physique athletes. And when they take in higher doses, they tend to have better body compositions. That doesn't necessarily mean that you get more lean muscle mass, but it means maybe you have more lean muscle mass in comparison to less body fat.
Okay.
And so that can be very beneficial. The leaner that you are, the more significant of a calorie deficit that you're in, the older you are, and the more muscle mass that you have, your daily protein needs likely increase.
Okay. The leaner you are, the older you are,
the more muscle mass that you have,
the more baseline muscle mass you have,
and the more significant of a calorie deficit that you're in.
Okay.
So for these people that tend to try to cut pretty drastically, upping to the higher end of that range that I recommended is probably a better idea, particularly if you have more lean muscle mass. Because the leaner that you are when you're in a calorie deficit, you are at a much greater risk for losing lean muscle. And so by taking in some more protein in conjunction with weight training and proper sleep, you're going to minimize lean muscle loss. As you get older, you're probably going to have some issues because there's an anabolic resistance. You become anabolically resistant to the response. And so adding in more protein tends to counterbalance that a good bit.
So when you're in a calorie deficit, a larger proportion of your calories should come from protein so that you're not losing your muscle mass.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in conjunction with weight training and proper sleep, yes.
Yeah.
And this is one of those nuances that the 1 gram or the 1 gram per centimeter height don't necessarily, touch at. But again, that's not wrong because it's still putting you in a good range, and it's still simple. And I think that when you're talking to the general population and trying to get them to really understand, I think keeping it simple is good. But this is a podcast that they can rewatch. And so when we talk about this, they can look back on this and say, okay, well, he said 0.72 to 1.5 grams, per pound of body weight in the non-obese, and that can be a beneficial thing. And maybe I enjoy eating 1.2 grams, and I actually find it better because it's more satiating. I actually feel like my body composition is a little bit better in that position, and so then you have a little bit more autonomy in what you choose. And I want to emphasize, you can go higher than the recommendations that I've said here. I don't really give recommendations higher than that because it's high enough as is.
Yeah.
And you probably aren't benefiting from anything beyond that as far as the research that I've seen from a body composition perspective, outside of maybe it's just your personal preference to eat a crap ton of protein.
Yeah.
Now, the good news is we have research that looks at even higher protein intakes than I've recommended. I mean, double what I recommended. Antonio and colleagues did it out of the ISSN for over a year for, the long periods of time. And there is no signs of negative health consequences from doing this, assuming it doesn't put you into a major calorie surplus and it doesn't push out other nutrients in your diet that you need.
Yeah, I think I read one when I was looking at protein. I forget for which video I made, but basically the biggest side effect was GI distress if you had like a lot of protein.
But you're going to have the same thing if you take in too much fat too, dietary fat. I mean, so you're balancing this diet anyway as per your preference, and at least now you have a range to be able to do it. Now, one thing that I do want to touch on along this vein is, and you're probably very familiar with this, you'll hear very often the myth that high protein intakes are bad for health, particularly when weight training is in play. It's not bad for health. In fact, it's only good. I mean, there's improved bone health, improved muscle mass, improved body composition. All of these things seem to benefit.
Yeah.
The confusion comes into play because of one of two reasons. Either somebody had had a family member, maybe a grandparent, that had had something like kidney disease. And when kidney disease is in play, there's a problem with filtering amino acids. And so you'll often hear from a nephrologist, hey, you want a low protein diet. Now, unfortunately, people are misinterpreting that as high protein intake causes kidney damage.
Right.
High protein intake does not cause kidney damage. It exacerbates kidney disease in a pre-existing condition. It can be problematic because you can't filter it.
Same thing with creatine.
Yes, it's an amino acid.
Right.
Yeah, so exact same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, beta and taurine, all those types of
Right.
things will do the same
Yeah.
thing. So you'll either hear it secondhand from a person who maybe was told that by their doctor or had a family member, or the doctor themselves has misinterpreted some of the data that they had from a nephrology course in medical school, and they don't realize that this is not pertinent to an otherwise healthy population.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to get that out there because there's always going to be somebody that's going to be like, but his recommendations are kind of high in certain circumstances. It's not problematic as long as you're getting in the rest of the nutrients that you need.
Yeah. And, I would say that 1.5 grams per pound of is it ideal body weight or total body weight?
Total body weight.
Total body weight.
I mean, this is assuming that you're not obese, though. If you're in a normal, type of body composition, if you're in the obese, the previous ones are much more appropriate.
The issue with obese terminology, again, using the BMI, which is not probably applicable to somebody who's has a large amount of lean body mass, right?
I would just use a visual assessment of body fat percentage if I was going to look for obese. And it's about 25% or more for men, a little bit over 30 for women. And go from there. And that's when I would start to use the height, and I would start to use the 1 gram per ideal body weight.
Got it. Yeah. And because those are easy to Google, you can Google body fat percentage photos and look at yourself in a mirror.
Yeah.
And
it's far more accurate than the in-body scans.
Yeah.
It is.
I believe that. Especially after what you told me, 8% deviation from normal. So that's pretty large. Like I understand why they sell so well because of the data, but I'm surprised that, it's so popular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's popular because I don't think that a lot of people really understand what they're seeing there. But as an example, you could do this just to test it out and see if I'm full of shit or not. So go get an in-body scan. Get your numbers, leave the in-body scan, go drink a liter of water, come back, take another scan. Your body fat percentage will go down significantly. Your lean body mass will go up significantly. Because hydration status massively affects it as well.
Yeah.
And so you can see that there are some errors in the way that this is done. And unfortunately, the reason that there are errors is it's an error upon an error. Because what they're doing is they created an equation based off of hydrostatic weighing. And then they took that equation that was an estimate on hydrostatic weighing, and they tried to put it into play with BIA, an electrical current. So it's an estimate of a previous estimate. And that's why the error starts to compound so badly.
Okay, we talked about protein. Other things in terms of designing a nutrition goal or program for a client?
So I would like to give a little bit of guidelines for dietary fat and dietary carbohydrates, because I think that if we can understand how these two fit in with protein, then we can actually start to build our plans really well. And I understand that macro tracking is not the be all end all for most people, and I actually don't recommend it for the large majority of people for extended periods of time. But I think that it is very important to do for maybe 3, 4, 5 months, to see where you are, to get an idea of what proper intakes look like, and to teach you how to make proper meals, composition. So dietary fat, this is simpler from a numbers perspective, but it is just as, if not more, controversial. I mean, dietary fat is another one of those necessary macronutrients. You need it for immune health, hormone health, cell wall integrity, joint health, brain, hair, nails, all these different types of things. If you're not obese, aiming for a minimum of 0.3 grams of dietary fat per pound of body weight is the right move. Okay. That's the minimum. Now, there's no maximum, because what you're going to do with your ratio of carbs to fat is you're going to figure out what fits within your total daily calorie targets, and then you can switch up your ratios depending on whatever you want to do there. The majority of your calorie intake should likely come from an unsaturated fat source. Now, this is where we can get into some controversy, and I want to talk about it a little bit, because if we can understand the nuance here, then maybe the controversy doesn't seem so scary. There's a lot of people that will say that saturated fat is always bad, and then there's some people that will say that saturated fat is in no way related to cardiovascular disease, and the reality is that both are wrong. Yeah. There's a little bit of nuance in there. Rather than a blanket statement of fat being good or bad, it's likely dependent on both genetic factors and the food in question, the food item in question. the healthfulness of fats is not simply a function of their content of saturated fatty acids. It has a lot to do with the components in the food, which is referred to as the food matrix. And when we look at the research that specifically looks at the food matrix and these different types of saturated fatty foods, whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, and dark chocolate are saturated fatty acid rich foods do not appear to majorly increase cardiovascular disease risk. So when we look at the evidence, the totality of evidence does not suggest further limiting these types of sources beyond the fact that they may contribute to a calorie surplus that can lead to excess body fat gain. And so we have this vilification of all of these different types of foods, and when it's outside of a major calorie surplus, it's probably not that problematic from a health perspective. I mean, eggs are one that really gets hit on a lot.
Yeah.
Unprocessed meats are one that gets hit a lot. And these probably aren't as bad as we've been led to believe. Now, they're probably pretty bad if they're causing a major calorie surplus.
Right.
But anything can be pretty bad when it's causing a major calorie surplus. When you're in a calorie surplus, this is when it starts to make more sense to think about different types of fats. And I mean, some of the research has looked at things like replacing some of your saturated fat intake with polyunsaturated fats. And you'll see 3 times more lean muscle mass gains and half the visceral fat gain with polyunsaturated fats. Rather than looking at this as saturated fat is bad, maybe it would be a good idea to start looking at this as some of these other fats have some distinct benefits, and maybe I should start eating some more fish, legumes, dairy, cheese, these types of things that can really provide some benefits. The general recommendation of keeping saturated fats to 10% of total daily calorie intake is probably a good recommendation for Gen Pop, just because a lot of us are eating saturated fat foods that are probably not the best sources. I mean, they're not eating lean, flank steak. They're not eating, some of these other sources. And so it's not a bad general recommendation. But understanding that there's nuance there, and that even just because a food contains saturated fatty acids doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It just means that, hey, we should be looking at this in the context of the overall diet, in the context of, the genetics that a person might have. And what I mean by that is if you have hypercholesterolemia or hyperlipidemia or some other issues where you have some more dramatic effects from your dietary fat intakes, well, maybe that's a reason to minimize some of these intakes. But for the large majority of people within a calorie intake that's intelligent, we should probably be okay with accepting that some of these are very healthful foods.
Yes. And that is very nuanced. And
when I was getting into it, I was like, hold on, we've got a conversation to have here.
No, and it's so important, right? Because you are right. So many of these foods are vilified. And so, I will often sit with my patients and be like, okay, what do you, I'll look at their cholesterol, I'll say, what are you eating? Right. And they're like, I have 6 eggs a day. I said, I have no problem with eggs, but in light of your current cholesterol, you probably need to cut back on from 6 to maybe 4 and, put in something that's leaner rather than eggs. Right. But it's looking at the whole picture. And that's why I agree with you. I think that documenting what you eat in some sort of food tracker for some period of time is super valuable, so you can understand just the things you eat day to day in and day out, what's in them, because otherwise you never think about it. Right.
Yeah. I mean, learning amounts will really help you to dial in that food composition that I was talking about earlier, because you'll finally start to realize what a spoonful of peanut butter actually is. Oh, God. And it essentially ruins your life. But here, I'm gonna give the reverse side to that. So you don't have to get rid of peanut butter, right? The good thing that I found when I started tracking was Nutella is about the same as peanut butter. So you can now add in Nutella to your diet and not feel so bad if you were fitting in peanut butter. And I think that that's one of those things where people are like, oh, Nutella's bad because it's this. Peanut butter's good because it's more natural, but it's kind of a toss-up between the two.
I did this the other day. I was in the mood for gummy bears. I don't know why. I don't usually get in the mood, but I was at the store and I'm looking at, the healthy gummy bears, healthy. And I'm looking at Lifesaver gummies, exactly same calorie intake, exactly same fat, exactly same sugar. And I'm like,
yeah,
what, you know what I mean?
There's a lot of marketing going on.
Yeah. And so I think that's the other thing is you learn to look at labels and you're like, oh, well, if I'm going to have something that is not good for me, or I'm going to add these calories to my day with the same exact macronutrient profile, then let me go for the thing that tastes the best.
Yeah. It makes you a much more conscientious consumer.
Yeah.
And then the cool thing about going for the thing that tastes the best, assuming that you have a good relationship with food. I mean, if it's a trigger food, that's a problem. Right. But assuming you have good relationships with food is maybe that's exactly what we were talking about earlier with what you needed for adherence and consistency. You finally got something that you felt met that need that you had, And now you can move on with life and you don't feel restricted.
Yes. And
Wonderful.
I think that's so important. At one point in time, I was able to lose a lot of weight. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to push myself further and stop eating sweets. And that was like the worst decision I ever made.
Yeah, that restrictive mindset was really killer. And it really makes a big difference to switch to an abundance mindset or something called core value eating.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've heard about core value eating before, but core value eating is essentially you switch your minds. It's the same thing, but you switch your mindset into a positive. And so you don't think about, I can't eat gummy bears or Pop-Tarts or whatever it is. You think, hey, I'm hungry and I want something sweet, so I'm going to choose to eat non-fat Greek yogurt with fruit in it instead. And that abundance mindset, thinking about it of what can I add into my diet, is a really beneficial thing. And that's why I like to talk about the fats with, okay, well, if we know that polyunsaturated fats may come with some distinct benefits, particularly in a calorie surplus, can we start to think about maybe adding in some, grilled fish into our daily meals? I mean, grilled fish tacos are wonderful.
They really are.
And you can make that very easily into a diet, whether you're trying to lose weight or gain weight.
And they have the omega-3 benefits. So
right.
Lots of good things there. So what about when you're out, right? Tips that you give your clients for when they're out with their friends, or they're at a restaurant, or they can't track or weigh, or whatever it is that they may be doing at home to help them maintain their nutrition.
So first, I have them put things in perspective. And what I mean by that is I will usually tell my clients, okay, for the next month, figure out what you're doing as far as your big events. Do you have holidays coming up? Do you have birthdays coming up? Do you have business luncheons coming up, and all those types of things? You can rank them from importance, least to most. When you're in something that's less important to you, you can say, hey, I'm going to moderate a little bit more here, and it's okay because I'm going to indulge a little bit more on some of these other meals, and that's okay. But typically, this is those situations where it's not appropriate to really count anything, because you're not going to bring a scale to a restaurant. No. So you follow habits and routines that you're set up. You eat until you're 80% full. If you're going to get dessert, then you forego the liquid calories. If you're going to have an appetizer, then maybe you get the grilled entree or those types of things. So you make concessions where you can, but then you also keep into your mental framework, okay, well, where does this fit within my quality of life, within how important this is to me? Because there are certainly going to be some situations where you're going to indulge more. I mean, a holiday that's coming up that you really enjoy, maybe you're going to let loose a little bit more. Having said that, and I want them to do that and be honest with themselves about how important that is with them. Having said that, literally the most important thing that you can do after being conscious of these decisions that you're making and saying, I'm okay with that because it's going to allow me to enjoy that day, and then cut out guilt. The second most important thing to do in that situation is to then have a plan to get back on track the very next meal or the very next day. And this is where people really screw these types of things up, because a lot of times they'll go into it and they'll say, hey, I'm really comfortable, having this cake or whatever it is. And then the next day it snowballs into another day of having the leftovers of that cake or, whatever it is. If you set up these days as, I know what's going on, I'm going to make conscious choices. I'm not going to be pulled into this emotionally. I'm going to enjoy it when I'm in it, but I'm not going to let emotion guide my choices that I have on these days, and go in with a plan, and then have a plan to get back on track. It literally allows you to enjoy those days more and gets rid of the guilt afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so important. And I think the other thing is, people will have that F it mindset, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I messed up, the rest of the day is done. Who cares? Or this weekend is done, or this vacation week is done. And that's where it becomes sort of like, now and not that you can't get back, you can always get back, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a matter of like, it's a little bit harder then, because you've like done, you're like, oh, now I'm going to take 2 weeks to recover from that week of indiscretion.
Well, so there's an interesting thing that we're bordering on here. So when people talk about habit formation, when you look at the research for habit formation, it takes between 18 and 256 days to build 95%
it's not
of a
the
new
21
habit.
days.
No, it's not 30 days to a new habit. That's absolute bullshit. It's 18 to 256 for 95% habit formation. That's kind of the bad news, because it can take some time. The good news is, even if you screw up, as long as you get back on track, it doesn't derail that habit formation. So you're going to have those days where maybe you eat a little bit more than what you thought that you ate. As long as you get back on track the very next day, you're going to be completely fine. And I think that knowing that can be a very reassuring thing and can actually help guide you back into play.
What about, there's a lot of content on social media about when to eat, particularly anabolic windows. Should you fast? Should you not eat after 8 p.m.? Let's debunk some of those myths.
So meal timing is an interesting concept, and there's nuance to it. There's nuance to overall meal timing, and there's nuance to that anabolic window that you had mentioned. The real thing that I want to emphasize to people is that total daily intakes matter far more than anything else. If you are unable to hit your total daily intakes, that's where you should be focusing your effort. Don't worry about anything else. You're going to be fighting for the minutia, essentially. Now, you can get some added benefit out of nutrient timing, but it is far and away less important than totals. So having said that, the anabolic window, based on what we currently know, does appear to be real. But rather than the 30-minute window post-workout, which is what we were traditionally told, I mean, growing up through the 90s and getting into lifting as I did then, I always used to think that I had to have a protein shake 30 minutes after a workout. Based on the current evidence that we have, and this is regardless of gender, because I've been hearing that there's been a new push that women have an anabolic window and men do not, which has not been shown. But based on the current evidence that we have, it appears that the anabolic window is more like an anabolic barn door. And so it appears to be about a 6-hour window pre and post exercises, the peri-workout window. And so the importance of the nutrition that we get, particularly the protein doses that we get around a workout, seem to be dependent on when we've eaten. And so if you've eaten within a couple hours before your workout, you likely have a lot longer after your workout before it's necessary for you to get something else in to maximize that muscle protein response and get the best benefits that you possibly can have. If you didn't eat prior to weight training, then eating closer post-workout probably makes a lot more sense. And that's where you start to focus on, hey, maybe I should be getting that 30 grams of protein in a bolus dose just post-workout, but that's really dependent on what happened before. And so this is to maximize the return. So for Gen Pop, is this really going to make a massive amount of difference? Maybe, maybe not. If you're comfortable in getting in your total intakes, and this is one of those things that you're saying, hey, it wouldn't really be very hard for me to adjust this as well. Well, there you go. You can have it either right before you go, you can have it right after you've gone, you can have it both if that fits in with the way that you eat.
Sure.
But that can give you a little bit of a benefit, probably a few extra percentage points if you're really pushing the envelope there.
Got it.
Now, as far as eating later at night, when we look at the research, it doesn't appear to matter the time of day that you eat. It doesn't affect body composition. It doesn't affect body fat accrual. It is entirely based off of calories in, calories out, whether you're going to gain weight or lose weight. Now, I always have to emphasize and preface that with, just because we talk about calories in and out, the energy balance equation, adjusting whether we gain or lose weight, doesn't tell everything about health, what we gain or what we lose. And that's when we started to get into that conversation of, how much protein should we have? How many, grams of fat should we have? There's actually one for carbs as well that can probably maximize lean muscle return. But the types of food that you choose do have effects on health. It just doesn't have that direct effect on the energy balance equation and whether or not you gain or lose weight. It just tells you what you gain and what you lose.
Because people would argue, right, that your metabolism is slower at night, and your body works on a circadian rhythm, and so that food is going to be a lot harder for you to work off.
I mean, they can argue that, but we don't see it when you actually look at the research. And so
that's what I was getting at.
You can argue. So here's the thing. There's one of the issues, and you probably have seen this all the time. One of the issues that we have with PhDs in particular, and this is not a shot at PhDs, but we tend to see this a lot with PhDs. PhDs versus people that work with actual patients. PhDs get focused on molecular data. They get focused on mechanistic data. And they tend to lose sight of the practical outcome data. Now, the practical outcome data is the most important because it shows when you do this, this is what happens. And so when we look at eating late at night and we equate calorie situations to eating it earlier in the day, we don't see a difference in body composition and body fat and weight gain or anything like that. It doesn't make a difference at all. The metabolism is just simply more complicated than, the circadian rhythm effects that we may see. And so it's not something that we see to worry about it in practicality. And if somebody's going to argue, well, mechanistically, this happens, but when we look at it in reality, the practical outcome doesn't happen the way that they're saying it happens. That means either the mechanism that they're looking at is too minute in scope. It's that flashlight pointing into the corner.
Yeah.
or they're not taking into account compensatory mechanisms that are in play.
Or it's not clinically significant, right? So
And that's usually what it tends to be.
So, there's a lot of studies that will say, XYZ increases testosterone, right?
I mean, autophagy is based entirely on this. Like the whole push for like, you have to do this to maximize autophagy is based off of the fact that like everything that they were saying was just not clinically significant or relevant.
Yeah.
You see this stuff all the time.
I mean, autophagy, you could just get with calorie restriction, right?
First off, autophagy is no different whether you fast or whether you just have a continuous diet with the same calorie restriction.
Right.
It's just the calorie deficit that does it. On top of that, other things cause autophagy. Exercising causes autophagy. So rather than starving yourself to death where you're going to lose lean muscle if you're doing all these insane fasting protocols, you could be in a calorie deficit to lose excess body fat, and you can exercise and still maximize the benefits of autophagy. But that's not being told in a lot of these podcasts because it sounds a lot sexier to say, hey, if we fast for 72 hours and
eat a cracker.
Yeah, and just drink some collagen, you're going to be fine. It's the weirdest recommendations. And if I were to tell somebody, 20 years ago, hey, if you want to get really healthy, just stop eating. Like, people would be like, what are you talking about? Or like intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is a really fun topic too, because intermittent fasting is one of these things that in practicality can work really well. It does not work based on the way that people say that it works, or at least the way that it's sold that it works. Intermittent fasting works because a calorie deficit provides benefits for body composition if there's excess body fat in play. And so if you're taking in less food than what your energy you're burning, you lose body fat.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether you have a calorie fasting window from 8 until noon, or people are like, well, what do I do if I have to eat an apple at 10?
Eat the
apple at 10. It's not going to make any damn difference.
Right.
But it's been sold as it's the fasting itself that has caused this benefit. And unfortunately, it's just a weird selling point. And I'm not against intermittent fasting as a strategy, but if we want to be honest about it, we just call it skipping breakfast. That's literally all it is.
Yeah.
If you say skipping breakfast, people who are really big in intermittent fasting get so offended.
They get upset.
But that's literally what it is.
Also, you're taking away the choice for people to snack at night, right? When your frontal lobe, your willpower reserves have diminished, right? And so if you get an urge or a craving, you have less reserves to really sort of talk yourself out of it at night. And so if you say, hey, I can't eat after 7, that's an easy rule to just follow.
That's perfect. And it sets it up really well because it gives you guidelines. And so it's funny when I talk to people about losing body fat, because one of the arguments that a lot of people make, a lot of fitness professionals make, is we like to think of things in black and white. And so some fitness professionals will say, oh, you just need to, get it done. It's all about willpower. And then there are other professionals that say there's no willpower involved. There's all these other complicating factors that are within a person's life. I kind of disagree with both because willpower certainly has something to do with it. But the difference between you, the person that's struggling, and Jill from down the street who is not struggling is you both have a finite level of willpower, but her habits and routines have been set up so she uses less of her willpower on the regular,
right,
which makes her life a lot easier. It's not that you both aren't using willpower. It's that yours is at red line and she is very minimally using willpower. And this might be one of those strategies that works, that allows a person to progress really well. I don't eat after 7. Okay.
It's a rule.
I mean, that's what Jill does. You could do that too, but you haven't set that down into a hard, fast rule. So you're not following that rule.
Right. And then you're allowing yourself to make a decision when Jill doesn't have to.
Right. She has no decision in play. Now, there is willpower that she's being tested at throughout the day, but she's minimizing those tests to her willpower and allowing her to actually put the willpower to where she needs to put it to make the right decisions.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, since you are obviously an oral surgeon, are there links between oral health and fitness?
There are certainly links to oral health and cardiovascular health. There's probably links to oral health and gut health. This is the problem with a lot of these areas, is this is places that we still are very minimal in the evidence from. So certainly cardiovascular health. I mean, we've got issues where we have infection spread from the mouth down into the heart, and that can cause a whole host of issues. But for overall health, I mean, it's all interconnected.
Yeah.
And we know very little about gut health, even gut health specialists. If you talk to any gastroenterologist, they'll be like, I don't know. If you talk to the random person on social media that has gut health expert in their profile, they'll tell you the longest diatribe about, what they think is happening, whereas the gastroenterologists are like, this is an area that we just don't know much about. You do the best that you can as a doctor in those fields, and I really feel for them because there's a lot of areas that we have a lot more knowledge in, but the gut is just not one of them.
Well, people are also having a lot of financial gain from making probiotic supplements or other things that may improve your gut health.
There's so much promise to them. I mean, there really is.
It makes sense.
There's a lot of promise to them, and there's a lot of situation. First off, this is probably going to be something that in like 20 or 30 years we look back on and we're like, we can really use them now to a good benefit.
Yes.
The problem is we're not there yet because we don't know what strains for which person, how much of each strain.
And will they last through the entire digestive tract to get to the colon where you actually need them to work?
Yeah, I mean it's really a strange thing. And then it only appears to be under certain circumstances. Are you on an antibiotic? Are you taking some of these other things? And just to point out how complex the gut microbiome is, fecal transplants. They've taken fecal transplants of lean, athletic individuals and put them into obese individuals, and they've seen proliferation of that microbiome, and yet it doesn't lead to any change. It doesn't. Well, not only does it not last, it doesn't lead to any changes of body composition or health.
Well, because you change your gut microbiome the second you eat something else, or
Well, it appears that the gut microbiome changes are secondary to your overall health, and so based on what you're eating, how you're exercising, how you're sleeping. Again, it's so funny whenever we talk about these things and we talk about emphasizing the main things because we always go back to the same thing. Well, how do I improve my gut health? Weight train, get your nutrition under control, stress relieve, eat right.
And I would add, hang out with good people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of stress relief. Yeah. But the same thing, if somebody asks, how do I build the most lean muscle? How do I, build my longevity and health? It's literally all the same answers. And that's why it's not sexy to say these things on like social media, because it's not something that's special or magical. But if we can start to get people to focus on these things, maybe we can actually break this cycle of being unhealthy.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you were, let's say, president of the United States and you could make...
I don't want that.
Okay. If you were in the... Neither do I. But if you were in the seat of being able to make change, is there some sort of legislation or something that you would implement that you think would make a huge difference in terms of society?
I think that the only thing that can really happen is a push for education. Because if we say, hey, you can't become a totalitarian situation, because where do you cut that off?
Right.
If you say you can't eat this, well, who makes that decision? Two, when does that might start with good intentions? When does that go off the rails?
And there's not just one thing, right? You can't
I mean, the issue, ultra-processed foods are a real issue, but ultra-processed foods are a real issue because of the frequency and the amount that we take in.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're the devil inherently. It's that they're hyperpalatable. They are very calorie dense. They're kind of nutrient devoid, and they have real effects on thermic effect of food. And so, people will typically understand they have a lot of calories and they don't have a lot of nutrients. They don't really understand the thermic effect of food aspect. And that's where the energy that's required to digest, absorb, and metabolize food. And it can be up to 15% of your total daily energy expenditure. So it's a significant amount of your metabolism. Ultra-processed foods are just much, much lower in that, which is why we see a 51% increased risk of obesity with ultra-processed food diets, why we see a 60% increased risk of low levels of lean muscle mass. And so having a predominantly ultra-processed food diet is a problem.
Right.
However, that doesn't mean that it can't have some benefits to our life. And this goes back to that conversation that we were having about the mental and emotional benefits that these provide. I mean, do you want to go to a Super Bowl Sunday and not have hot dogs? I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, that
Wings
sounds,
for me, but yes.
That sounds awful though.
Yeah.
I don't want to go and have crudité at my, at these events.
Yeah.
And so there is some real benefit to having some of these things in our food supply if we can be responsible with the way that we eat them, if we can be responsible with the way that we advertise them, if we can be responsible with the way that we utilize these into a diet that accounts for a whole minimally processed base.
Yeah.
And so when you ask what specific things can you do, the only thing that I can think of is to increase education in PSAs. And the reason that I say that is because it was actually extremely effective with smoking. Maybe we do something similar with this in a manner, and I'm not against things like warning labels on these types of things, because at least if there's a warning label, it'll still allow you to have that choice.
Right.
But at least it reminds you, hey, this is garbage. or however they want to put it.
Yeah.
And again, I'm being tongue in cheek here. I don't want to vilify, say one food is bad, one food is good. But the reality is certain foods are more nutritious than others.
Absolutely. And I think the other issue is food deserts, right? There are many areas in our country.
I live in Hawaii.
Yeah, it's a food desert.
It's a huge food desert.
And you don't have access as easily or readily to whole unprocessed foods, right? They have to get shipped in and they're at a higher cost, a higher premium. And
fast food is cheaper where I live than going to the grocery store.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And there's so many areas of the country where that's the case. And, by just focusing on the ultra processed foods, like making them less accessible means that some people just don't have any food at all. Right. And so we have to sort of,
this is a problem of the gentry.
Yeah.
And so we have to be very conscious about what we're doing as far as that goes, because there's not a one size fits all solution. Mm-hmm. And I can recognize the problems of a diet that is based on ultra processed foods.
Absolutely.
But I can also recognize that sometimes they may provide some benefits in the context of the emotional experience of eating in life.
Yeah.
And so, what do you do? I will typically tell people that I want to see the majority of your foods from whole minimally processed foods, then having a discretionary calorie intake of maybe 5 to 20% of your total daily calories is a good sustainable idea for general population for most people. Mm-hmm. Now that's going to vary based off of your personal goals, based off of personal preferences, based off of sustainability. And, maybe if there's somebody that wants to step foot on a bodybuilding stage, maybe they're at the 5%. Maybe if there's somebody that is a man that's at 20% body fat, he's got perfect health markers, he's very comfortable with his body composition, maybe he's closer to 20%.
Yeah.
And obviously the frequency and the extent to which you do it is going to add in as well. But I think by telling people that you can't have ultra processed foods or it somehow makes you inherently wrong or bad, I feel like we're going back to sex education in the 90s and 80s, and you're like,
you mean
just
still
don't, yeah.
In some
I don't have
some
kids,
states.
so I don't have kids, so I don't really know how that goes. But
it depends on what state you live in.
But it's like, just don't have sex, and you're like, but what if just don't have sex? You're like, but like, no, and that's not like, how is that going to help? That's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So instead of making it a blanket, this is bad, you should never do it, say, this isn't as good as this, true, but this might be how you incorporate it if you so choose. And if a person says, I don't want to incorporate ultra processed foods into my diet because it's garbage, more power to you. You're not hurting yourself by not eating ultra processed foods. Nobody is gaining health by eating ultra processed foods.
Right.
But, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot by, like I said before, being totalitarian about it. Mm-hmm. And saying this is the only way and you have to confer to my way, when practically it's not going to work out the way that you think.
Yeah.
On top of the fact that if that does happen, there's going to be some serious consequences, I think, trickling down. What ends up happening to the jobs that people have that work for companies that produce that? What happens to states that rely on those factories that they have set up? And this is just spitballing, even more, but this is a far more complicated issue than what we're being led to believe.
Absolutely. The economic downstream consequences will be severe.
What happens to the mom and pop shop that makes donuts?
Yeah.
Too bad? And now what happens? Do they lose their home? Do we all start to pay for them, to support them? Like, it becomes really problematic. It's disrupting the society, when I think what we should be doing is actually extolling the virtues of the whole minimally processed foods and teaching people how to incorporate some of these into their life in a productive manner.
What's so interesting, we told our younger son, that, some of these foods, like, they actually have scientists researching to find the way that it's most addicting to you, right? And so he actually will be like, oh, I don't want that. I don't want that because they're trying to make me addicted to that. And maybe that's a little bit of an extreme thing, but he sort of is like, well, I want to eat, and he has a very good relationship with food. He's like, I'll eat something if I want to, but I don't want to eat that, The other
thing that I think that parents should really start to focus on is the fact that kids will eat what is available to them. Mm-hmm. And I say this because I'm not saying that you can't have treats for your kids, but if you give your kids options, and I like the idea of giving your kids like two options. Say, hey, look, for dinner, do you want this or this?
We don't do that.
If they choose not, you just give them the whatever it is.
They eat what we eat.
Well, see, and that's even better.
Yeah.
But there are so many people that I work with that are like, oh, I can't eat that because my kid won't eat it. I'm like, this is not what I grew up with.
Yes.
I either went to bed hungry or I ate whatever it was. And I think that that's a really good thing to have with kids, because this is what teaches them what real meals look like. This is what teaches them to appreciate whole minimally processed foods. Again, we should be coming at this from a point of positivity and abundance, and not from a you can't have that.
Yeah.
Why don't we get them used to eating whole minimally processed foods? If you eat whole minimally processed foods for the majority of your diet, have a Coke that you haven't had in 6 months. It burns your mouth and you're like, man, that was good for about a sip and now I just don't want it anymore. And it's amazing how that works. And so what we're doing is, it's like when you're training, this is a really bad analogy. When you're training a dog, the best way to train a dog is through positive reinforcement. Everybody works that way. Mm-hmm. Beating the dog, yelling at him, saying, no, you can't do this. You are not only not going to get the result that you want, you may actually get some pushback.
Yeah.
If you start to come at it from, this is why it's really important, these are the benefits that you can get from this is where we want to go, run those PSAs for 20 years in a row, just like they did with smoking. Mm-hmm. You're going to start to see some changes. And you really do see the younger generations being more open to these types of changes than our generation and older. And that's probably a good thing.
Well, the education wasn't there widely available as it is now about nutrition. I mean, it's still like, think about our training. We didn't learn that much about nutrition.
I mean, it's not
And
cool.
So
there's like 1-2 month course that you can opt into.
There's not. I think you did like, you just learn about the macronutrients and what they do. And like, that's it. That's all you learn. And it's amazing that, we're the ones trying to prevent disease and counsel people on nutrition, and people have questions, right? And then you're not equipped to answer them unless you do your own research.
In defense of doctors, though, there's a lot that doctors need to learn. And I think that when people expect them to know everything, it can be a recipe for a disaster.
Absolutely. But I do think our primary care doctors should be able to focus more on prevention. Like, I recall a good friend of mine in med school did a fellowship in preventative care, but I was like, why is that not standard? Yeah. Why shouldn't everyone who's in primary care get the high quality education for prevention? Like that should be our first line. Yeah. But there's a lot there. What are you doing right now that you're excited about?
I am starting up group fitness coaching. I'm doing a revamp of my website and getting that going. I wanted to be able to help out people a little bit more. I mean, I do a lot of one-on-one coaching that's very extensive. And if people have issues with, dealing with cravings and have been on the diet roller coaster all their lives and really want in-depth nutrition coaching, one-on-one is really the answer. Apps just don't cover it. I mean, the big thing with coaching and revamping habits that you've had for your entire life is there's a lot psychological there.
Yes.
And you're not going to get that with an app. So that's what I've been doing traditionally for years and years and years. What I wanted to do is I wanted to bring in some good programming for people that largely have control over what they're doing in life, but they wanted to really dial in their training and really dial in the way to progress that training. And so what I'm instituting here in 2025 is a new group coaching functionality with group fitness. I'm really excited about this because what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a whole community website to be able to talk on a message board, have all the different videos for exercise demos, have cycling exercise programs going, every 6 weeks changes up and teaches people how to progress. And going to do it in a manner that is pretty good from a cost perspective,
That's great.
Close to $1 a day.
That's really good.
Yeah.
That's really great.
Yeah.
And, I think that's so valuable. Like, doing things in a group makes it so much more likely that you're gonna stick to it.
Yeah, it gives you that little bit of buy-in, and then you feel like there are other people there with you. And this is one of those big pushes that I really want to make with helping people to gain some more lean muscle, because I think that we can start to gain some lean muscle. We will actually counterbalance some of these problems that we've been trying to fix all along. We're always grinding against losing body fat, and there may be a reason that we're not always super successful in doing this.
Yeah.
Because we're taking the wrong path to get there.
Yeah.
And if we start to focus on building lean muscle and valuing the performance that our bodies can do, then this might be the way to actually see those benefits that we're going for from physique anyways.
So we end our podcast with some questions we ask everybody. So what is something you know now in your life that you wish you knew earlier? It doesn't have to be about fitness and nutrition.
I wish I knew networking a little bit better. And this is kind of a weird thing, but getting in from medicine where your network essentially builds itself, right?
Yeah.
And then moving into the social media space. I wish I was better at that. And I think that I wish I was better at that, not just from a business perspective, but I think that I would have more friends. Yeah. And the funny thing about being older than like 30 is that, your pool of friends start to disappear. And so it was a funny answer because it almost seems like it's always business related, but I think that it's an extremely valuable thing because I think that it can be good for, your mind to stimulate you with new friends, your soul for quality of life, for stress relief.
Yeah.
And I think that if we can get into really taking advantage of some of these opportunities, and it's never been easier with online communities, I wish that I would have taken full advantage of that earlier in life.
Yeah, I think networking is so valuable. I mean, I've made so many friends through Instagram and through social media that like are very close friends now. Yeah. And it's wild. Like and some of them are business partners. Some of them are great friends. Some of them are, just fun to have a conversation with. And I think that's super valuable.
Well, and oftentimes you'll have more contact time with them than the people that you know in real life.
Yeah.
Because you spend so much time, I mean, at least in our professions, you spend so much time online that these become the people that you end up talking to day in and day out.
Absolutely. Do you have a non-negotiable, something you have to do every day?
I have to exercise every day.
No rest days.
There's no rest days, but there's no rest days in an intelligent manner. So that doesn't mean that I'm weight training really heavy every day. It means what I typically do is I'll weight train 5 days a week. I do a lot of walking with my dog, and then on 2 off days that I have, I get in some runs, do some cardio work. And if I'm beaten down, I'll make sure to take a day off. But I typically don't need that because of the way that I modify my volume when I progress. So staying active is good because it helps both that mental aspect, that stress relief aspect as well. And
then it becomes a habit, right? You do it every day.
Yeah.
Do you have a life hack or health hack you would share that you haven't talked about today?
Listen to what your wife says. It's probably the safest thing that you can possibly do. Actually, this is the life hack that I really want to point out is build a circle of people that are driven just like you are. And my wife made me think about this because when we were switching into setting up Maui Athletics, my coaching company, and she was coming on and everything, she was so positive about the experience and saying, hey, yeah, let's do this. And then talking to a bunch of my friends that I grew up with in Maryland that were starting their own businesses. And then we bounced these ideas back and forth. And, people that are on the same kind of fitness journey that you are on, if you can find a community of like-minded friends and foster those relationships, I mean, that's just an amazing thing for your quality of life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you couldn't be, previously an oral surgeon and now a fitness and health coach, what would you be?
Here's the thing. Are we talking about a dream job that I would love to do and have no ability to do? Because there's one that pumps into my mind immediately.
Now you have to tell us what it is.
I would absolutely love to be an author.
Yeah. Aren't you writing a book?
I am writing a book, but I would like to be a fantasy fiction author.
Okay.
So I'm kind of a nerd.
No, I would love to be a writer as well for fiction. I am not. I am not that creative.
So that's the problem is I start to read books. I'm like, man, this guy's really smart.
But it's all trainable, right? Like you could if you wanted to.
I always wonder if I could pull that off. But if I could pull that off, that would be the dream job for me.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. What's your favorite fantasy book?
Wheel of Time.
Okay.
Is
a good one.
Really up there. If you can get through books 6 through 9, it tends to be really good. Malazan Book of the Fallen is really good. And believe it or not, do you read fantasy novels?
I just got into them with the Fourth Wing and the Iron Flame books.
Okay. Yeah.
That was the first time I really got into it. And I was like, oh, these are pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, they can be really cool. If you get into like high fantasy that actually builds worlds and everything like that. And a lot of people know that mostly through like Lord of the Rings and Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
And they're good books. I mean, Lord of the Rings is essentially what's set up.
Yeah, I read Game of Thrones, almost all of them, not the last one.
Well, they haven't gotten.
I mean, no, I don't think I stopped at like 3 or 4. So at 4 and 5, I still.
He's kind of an interesting author.
Yeah,
he gets into he likes to see himself talk, I think. But Wheel of Time's really good. Malazan Book of the Fallen is good if you can get through something that's a little bit more complex. When you first read it, if you decide to read it, don't give up on the first book. You're going to be completely lost when you read it because they literally just throw you into the middle of the story and you're like, I don't know who these people are or what's happening. But it becomes easier as you continue to read it. The other one, if you want another group of books to kind of lean into that is almost like a guilty pleasure, R.A. Salvatore does these books that were essentially based on the original Dungeons and Dragons stuff.
Oh.
And it is in the first few trilogies, you're like, oh, this is okay. It's entertaining, and I'm going to get into it. And then all of a sudden, he's been doing this since the 80s. And then all of a sudden, he really hits his stride, and the books become pretty excellent at this series called the Sellsword Trilogy and onward.
Okay.
And then you're like, man, these are really in-depth.
Cool.
They get really cool.
Yeah, my son is into them now, so I've been looking for books for him.
Those would be good ones.
Yeah.
R.A.
Okay.
Salvatore, because like I said, they're not as complicated as things like Wheel of Time, where you've got all these like geopolitical things going on
Right.
and everything like that. It's more of straightforward stories. And in the beginning, the writings. How old is your son?
He's 11. My oldest. Is
Okay,
11.
so this will actually be perfect for him if you
Okay.
give it to him in the time frame that they chronologically, because there's about 40 books.
Yeah. But he likes that. He likes having a series, so he'll.
So
enjoy that.
when he first starts, it's a little bit more simplistic with the writing, and then it gets better and better over time. And so I've talked with people about it before, and they're like, yeah, I read a couple of his books, and it was okay, but I didn't think it was great. I was like, where did you go? Like, how far did you get? And so that's where I usually push people, keep going. It's going to get a lot better.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Where can people find you?
You can head over to mauiathletics.com and see my website, or you can reach me on Instagram at Dr. Allan Bacon, Drallan. You just have to spell the first name right.
Yes, Allan with an A, a second A.
And 2 L's.
And two
Yeah.
L's. No, his Instagram is amazing, and you provide so much wonderful content for free, and it is thorough, evidence-based, like debunks a ton of myths. So definitely check him out, and thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you, Rena.
Thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode of the Rena Malik MD podcast. If you guys are enjoying this content, make sure to follow this podcast and leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This helps people find this podcast and learn from all the wonderful free evidence-based information that we provide here each and every week. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.